Chapter 3042. Due to this subtle distortion, the island's nomological laws seemed to have been stripped of a filter that was supposed to exist. In the mortal world, there were special books that were printed with two colors of text. When using such books, as long as a certain color filter was placed on the pages, the text printed in that color would not be visible, and the book would naturally become a completely different book. At this moment, the situation on this island was similar. However, the original nomological laws seemed to have been covered by a layer of filter, causing the nomological laws to be missing a lot. Now, after the distortion, the situation seemed to have removed the filter, causing the things that were originally covered by the filter to be revealed again, causing the nomological laws to look like a completely different set of nomological laws. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan suddenly had a realization. Perhaps normal nomological laws had countless faces, and the structure of the nomological laws that he was familiar with might only be an extremely insignificant small part of them. This was the case even though the structure of the nomological laws that he was familiar with was so numerous that ordinary living beings could not imagine it. If that's the case, I might have missed out on too much in the past. This thought surfaced in his mind. Although he had carefully studied nomological laws in the past and had also explored their structure to a certain extent. However, he placed this kind of investigation on the back burner. All this while, he had never truly systematically analyzed the possible structure of nomological laws. From the beginning, his research on nomological laws had only been based on the type of nomological laws that he had encountered in the world. It could be said that this was an extremely random research method. Under this kind of research, although there were many types of nomological laws that he had encountered, and it could only be measured in trillions of them to be able to clearly measure them. However, these nomological laws were extremely chaotic. All the nomological laws were scattered in his mind like a plate of loose sand, and there was no real complete system at all. Under this kind of research, it could be said that as long as there was a slight change in any nomological law, he would treat it as a completely different nomological law. If he had the heart to research, he would have to spend a lot of time to be able to thoroughly study these nomological laws that had only changed by a little. It was obvious that this was a huge flaw. At first, he did not care about such a flaw, nor did he think much about it. After all, he had always been concerned about the Great Path and the worldview behind it. As for the nomological laws, he only treated them as a way to comprehend the Great Tao. He didn't really treat them as an indispensable research object. But now, after discovering the strange appearance of this world, he realized that perhaps his way of thinking about rules and laws had always been wrong. The laws and laws might contain even more profound mysteries, containing even more marvelous laws. The relationship between it and the Great Tao might not be as simple as he thought. With a thought, he began to sense the Great Tao of this world. With this, he confirmed his thoughts. Indeed, the relationship between the Great Tao and the rules and laws was not as simple as he had previously thought. The reason he made such a judgment was very simple. It was because he sensed that the Grand Tao of this world wasn't any different from before. That's right, even though the current nomological laws of this world had been distorted into something unfamiliar and incomprehensible to him, causing the entire world to behave differently from before. However, the Great Tao of this world was still the same as when he had first sensed it. There wasn't even the slightest change. It was just like how the changes in the nomological laws were absolutely insignificant changes to the Great Tao. The nomological laws and the Great Tao don't have a one-to-one correspondence. This conclusion could be easily reached. The nomological laws were derived from the Great Tao. Luo Fan had known this a long time ago. He had even relied on this principle to create worlds and open up new worlds. Because his focus was more on the Great Tao, he didn't think much about whether there was any information that he had overlooked. He just directly corresponded the nomological laws to the Great Tao. He felt that a certain great Tao corresponded to a certain nomological law, and a certain nomological law corresponded to a certain great Tao. Apart from the division of labor, the two were almost equivalent. However, with this discovery, he knew that he had been thinking too much. Perhaps the nomological laws corresponded to a certain great Tao, but the great Tao definitely didn't just correspond to one nomological law. Any great Tao should be able to derive countless sets of nomological laws. In other words, there are countless layers of nomological laws. This judgment directly appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. That was the only way such a situation could occur. The relationship between the great Tao and nomological laws should be in the form of a tree-like structure. The great Tao was the root at the bottom of the tree-like structure, and the layer of nomological laws should be the countless branches that grew from the root. Obviously, a tree root corresponded to more than one type of branch. Too many thoughts surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at once. Most of them were related to one thing, and that was the nomological worldview. The nomological worldview obviously corresponded to a certain great Tao. However, the current nomological worldview wasn't perfect, and there was still a huge gap from truly corresponding to a certain perfect great Tao. However, no matter what, it was already an independent worldview that could support the existence of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Naturally, it could also correspond to a certain great Tao that wasn't perfect, but was still generally complete. This great Tao was the great Tao of the world of laws. In the past, Luo Fan had only reached this step before directly establishing the appearance of a world of laws. Thus, he had even opened up one world of laws after another. In fact, not long ago, he relied on such a world of laws to easily subdue the abnormal willpower derived from the essence of the world of laws in the appearance of the middle-aged woman. But now, after discovering that the relationship between the great Tao and the nomological laws wasn't what he had thought before, he understood that the world of laws he knew in the past was just the result of his assumptions. Or rather, it was just one of the billions of possible appearances that the world of laws could have. The true appearance of the world of laws should be a system, an extremely complicated system with countless branches. If he really understood this point, the world of laws he constructed every time shouldn't have just one appearance, but should have countless appearances. In fact, it was possible that every time he constructed a world of laws, it would be completely different from the world of laws that he had constructed in the past. Only then would it be reasonable. As he realized this, he suddenly felt that his cultivation realm had improved greatly. The bottleneck between the seventh tribulation powerhouse and the eighth tribulation powerhouse had become shaky at this moment, as if it would completely collapse in the next moment. In addition, he sensed that the arrival of the eighth tribulation had also been reduced to nearly 100 million years in the blink of an eye. The amount of time that had been reduced was enough to shock ordinary cultivators. From these two changes, it could be seen how huge the benefits that little bit of understanding had brought him were. If one were to calculate it in multiples, then the difference between the current him and the previous him was at least 100 times more. In other words, at this moment, he could easily erase everything that had happened a moment ago with a single finger. 100 million years. Sensing the upcoming eighth tribulation, Luo Fan's emotions were inexplicably complicated. It had not been long since the seventh tribulation, but he did not expect the eighth tribulation to arrive so soon. 100 million years was a long period of time that could make ordinary living beings despair. However, for existences at Luo Fan's level, 100 million years could probably pass in the blink of an eye. It could be said that the remaining 100 million years seemed to be right in front of him. However, compared to the fear he had for the great calamity in the past, he was now looking forward to it more. After communicating with Taoist Hong Kuo, he had already understood that the Great Tribulation was the true cultivation path that he had taken. Although entering the Great Tribulation would be dangerous, it was more of an opportunity. compared to the outside world, the Great Tribulation was more suitable for him to cultivate and improve himself. It was also because of this that his Great Tribulation would continuously advance as his cultivation realm increased. It was not like other tribulations that would not change in time, advance, or delay like other tribulations. Of course, at the same time, ordinary tribulations would also completely restrict the cultivation level of the person undergoing the Great Tribulation, such that they could not continue to improve without passing the Great Tribulation. However, Luo Fan's Great Tribulation did not have such a restriction at all. After all, according to the nature of the Great Tribulation, one's cultivation level was merely the qualification to enter the Great Tribulation, which was a land of opportunity. As long as one was qualified, one could step into the land of opportunity. That way, there was no need for a fixed time, and there was no need to restrict one's cultivation level. For example, if a person scored 60 points in an exam, what qualification could he get? However, it did not mean that the person could not score higher. In fact, if one did well, one might even be qualified in advance. It was the same for Luo Fan's Great Tribulation. For the Great Tribulation, once his cultivation level reached a certain level, he would be qualified to trigger the Great Tribulation. However, if that was the case, the Great Tribulation could only come slowly and at its own pace. However, if he cultivated harder and allowed his cultivation level to continuously increase, it would be equivalent to obtaining the qualification to enter the Great Tribulation in advance. The more his cultivation level increased, the more he would obtain in advance. That was all. He had already thought of these things when he was conversing with Taoist Hongqua and listened to his master's description of the path of retrogression through Taoist Hongqua. Therefore, he did not need to consider these things at all. At that moment, he only felt complicated about the Great Tribulation that would descend in 100 million years. After a while, he calmed himself down. With a slight thought, the dimension he was in was instantly enveloped by the illusion of a world. The illusion of the world exuded a strong charm that belonged to the world of laws. Clearly, this was the illusion of the world of laws. However, compared to the past, the appearance of this world of laws was completely unfamiliar to Luo Fan. Although there was still the main body of the world and many parallel places, it was still billions of times larger than the world created by ordinary world creators. However, be it the main body of the world or the many parallel places, their appearance was already completely different from the previous world of laws. In fact, if it were not for the charm that belonged to the world of laws, no one would be able to connect it with the previous world of laws. It felt as if there were countless parallel worlds in this world. Sure enough, I can do it as long as I'm aware of it, Luo Fan lamented as he sensed the appearance of the world of laws. The world of laws in front of him was a world that was constructed completely in accordance with the world of laws. However, compared to the past, he didn't preset its appearance this time. He just followed the framework of the nomological worldview and allowed the framework to develop. He allowed it to derive great Daos, and then laws and laws to form a complete world. Because he did not preset its appearance, this world developed into a completely different appearance from any world of laws he had seen before. However, compared to the world of laws he knew in the past, the world in front of him seemed to be more natural. The many laws seemed to be more harmonious, and the operation seemed to be smoother. He even vaguely felt that there was some kind of inexplicable strange existence in this world of laws. Although there were not many, it was quite obvious to him. This kind of strangeness made Luo Fan feel rather familiar. It was the same kind of strangeness that existed in the world outside at this moment. This is, the formation of heaven and earth was affected by the outside world, or was it affected by the environment? Luo Fan felt this strange and familiar feeling, and his heart sank into thought. Chapter 3043. At this moment, although the projection of the world of laws around Luo Fan was very different from this land of opportunity, The subtle similarities between the laws still linked the two closely. No one would think that the two weren't related. If that's the case, what would the world look like if it were to be established in the true state of chaos? A strong sense of curiosity suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. The world constructed with the worldview as the foundation would show corresponding changes according to the environmental conditions, turning into a form corresponding to the environment. If this property was placed in the state of chaos, it would be difficult to imagine what the world of laws might look like after it was unfolded. Will it absorb the characteristics of the state of chaos and possess the characteristics of the state of chaos? Or will it directly present an extremely complicated structure, or will it present an extremely natural structure? Luo Fan couldn't help but start guessing what the world of laws would look like if it were to be unfolded in the state of chaos. However, these guesses could only remain as guesses in the end. Currently, his worldview of laws wasn't enough to support the world of laws to be unfolded in the state of chaos. If he dared to unfold the world of laws in the state of chaos at this time, what awaited him would definitely be the destruction of everything in the state of chaos, followed by the complete erasure of his existence. Therefore, he could only speculate about what his world of laws would look like in the state of primal chaos. If he wanted to confirm his conjecture, he would have to at least pass the 9 great tribulations and finally become a true sage before he could really do it. Before that, his conjecture about what the world of laws would look like in the state of chaos could only be guesses. It was just like his conjecture about what kind of power and feelings a true sage would have. Before he truly became a true sage, everything could only be a conjecture. Not to mention that no one would tell him, even if someone did, he probably wouldn't be able to understand or imagine it. With all these thoughts in his mind, he could only put these doubts aside for the time being. He instantly retracted the projection of the world of laws that appeared around him, and the complete projection of the world of laws disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. Next, with another thought, the projection of the world of laws unfolded once again and covered the cultivation field of this alternate dimension. Compared to before, the appearance of this world had changed again. It seemed to be a completely different world from the one before. However, although they were two completely different worlds, the subtle strangeness hidden in the world, or rather, hidden in the laws of this world, was almost exactly the same. Both were extremely similar to the land of fortuitous opportunities outside. Luo Fan smiled faintly as he sensed that this world of laws was completely different from the one he had seen before, but it was also subtly similar. At this stage, there was no doubt that a great Tao could correspond to an infinite number of nomological laws. After confirming this point, the significance to him was incomparably great. First of all, this kind of understanding could finally make a breakthrough in an important part of his worldview that was originally missing from 0 to 1. Next, as long as he worked hard in this direction, his worldview would naturally be perfected to a whole new level. Secondly, after confirming this point, the way he studied the nomological laws would obviously become more orderly. His original state of studying whatever he encountered would be completely changed from now on. Of course, it wasn't that simple to completely complete this change. At the very least, he needed to first find the corresponding way between the Great Tao and the nomological laws. The Great Tao and the nomological laws didn't correspond one-to-one. Instead, they corresponded one-to-many. A Great Tao could correspond to the structure of countless nomological laws. In that case, what was the specific corresponding way between the Great Tao and the nomological laws? If he wanted to truly change his research method on the nomological laws, it was obviously necessary to find this corresponding way. This was like two related variables in mathematics. It was obviously impossible to study these two variables in depth just by knowing their correlation. Only by truly determining the correlation function between the two could it be studied in depth. At this time, for Luo Fan, What he should do the most was to find the correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws. What was the use of doing this? The most obvious use was that as long as he knew the correlation function, he could easily find the structure of the nomological laws corresponding to a huge number of great Tao. It was just like facing this land of opportunity. If Luo Fan had already known the correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws, he wouldn't have found the distortion of the nomological laws before him strange. In other words, if he knew about the correlation function, he would feel that everything in this world was within the scope of his understanding, even if the world had turned into such a state. He would be able to clearly grasp the logic behind all the changes that he originally couldn't understand. Furthermore, if he wanted to, he could even go a step further and derive even stranger and more unbelievable nomological laws. Even if it was just used to study the world, this change would be extremely significant. Not to mention, if it was used in battle, the attacks of the world that originally didn't have much power against true powerhouses would also be revitalized and possess unimaginable power. It was just like how the Seventh Tribulation powerhouse was currently enduring the attacks of this land of opportunity. His entire body was constantly being devoured and assimilated by this land of opportunity. Normally speaking, a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse could create millions of worlds with a wave of his hand. Perhaps the level of a world was far inferior to a perfect world that could exist in a state of chaos for a long time, but it was still a world. It wouldn't be easy for a Seventh Tribulation powerhouse to destroy a perfect world, but it would definitely be extremely easy for him to break through and transcend the world. But at this moment, how was the Seventh Tribulation powerhouse facing this world? He was completely immersed in the methods of this world, and he couldn't transcend it at all. And the only difference between this world and other worlds was that the nomological laws of this world had become rather strange due to various factors, and if Luo Fan grasped the correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws of this world, he could easily create thousands of such strangeness. In fact, not to mention this degree of strangeness, he could even create more profound and unimaginable strangeness. When he reached that step, he would be able to easily accomplish anything that could be done in this world. The fundamental reason for this was actually very simple. It was because ordinary powerhouses didn't realize that there was such a correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws of this world. They were all like Luo Fan before, thinking that there was a one-to-one correspondence between the great Tao and the nomological laws of this world. Because they didn't realize that there was some kind of correlation function between the two, they couldn't understand some of the unorthodox changes in the nomological laws of this world. And once they couldn't understand it, then it would be a hopeless situation for them. That was why the Seventh Tribulation powerhouse had suffered a calamity. In fact, was the attack that the Seventh Tribulation powerhouse encountered really so difficult to resist? Actually, that might not be the case. As long as he could understand the source of that strangeness, and not be assimilated by it, it wouldn't take much effort to break through the world that imprisoned his mind. However, because he couldn't understand the source of that strangeness, he could only become a fat pig that was being slaughtered at will. He didn't even realize that he was being slaughtered at will. It wasn't easy to find the correlation function between the great Tao and the nomological laws of this world. Even though Luo Fan had already realized the existence of the correlation function between the two, it was still the same. After all, normally, a great Tao would only display a certain corresponding characteristic due to the environment. Under such circumstances, in a certain location, one could only obtain the structure of the rules and laws derived from a certain great Tao in a certain environment. In other words, one could only obtain a certain result of that correlation function at a certain location. If that kind of correlation function was regarded as an equation, it was equivalent to a certain solution of an equation with unknown number of variables. Obviously, it was almost impossible to completely determine the entire equation through this definite solution. And if a world existed, it would exist. Its surrounding environment had been determined, and it had been determined. That solution was also a fixed solution. If it were another world, then everything would be completely different. Then, different solutions would be different solutions to different equations, and there would naturally be no relationship between the two. Therefore, it was impossible to obtain that correlation function just by comprehending the world and the structure of the various nomological laws of this world, even if one comprehended the entire world that existed in the state of chaos thousands of times. Luo Fan thought about it, and he frowned deeply. It was impossible to achieve this just by comprehending the world. In that case, the only way was to open up a world himself. If one were to open up a world casually, it would be difficult to fix the great Tao of the world that was opened up. This was equivalent to randomly pointing at a coordinate system, but it was impossible to determine whether these points belonged to the same diagram. It would not be of any help in obtaining that correlation function at all. Therefore, it was obviously impossible to open up a world casually. If one couldn't open up a world casually, there seemed to be only one way. It seems like I instinctively know how to get this correlation function. After a long time, his face relaxed and his expression suddenly became relaxed. In fact, he had already demonstrated the specific method to obtain that correlation function. That's right, it was to open up his world of laws. Compared to the world that was opened up casually, the world of laws had a characteristic, which was that it was completely derived from the world of laws. The great Tao of the world that was derived from the world of laws was obviously corresponding to the world of laws. In other words, the great Tao of all such worlds was the same. In that case, as long as the world of laws was opened up in different locations or even at different times, it would be equivalent to the same great Tao being derived from the various nomological layers according to different environment. If it was described mathematically, it would be like confirming that the next point in a coordinate system was the same diagram, or in other words, the coordinate points of the same function. In that case, as long as there were enough coordinate points, the diagram would naturally be obtained. And as long as the diagram was obtained, the function would naturally be obtained, of course. This was obviously not a simple thing. After all, Luo Fan didn't even know how many variables there were in this correlation function. In order to truly obtain this correlation function, the number of points needed would probably be unimaginable. Besides, although the relationship between the great Tao and the nomological layer was defined by the correlation function, in fact, the relationship between the two was hundreds of millions of times more complicated than the correlation function in the general mathematical sense. This made it even more difficult to find the relationship between the two. It could be said that even the legendary Millennium Prize problem, 100-year problem, 1000-year problem, or even billion-year problem in mathematics could be said to be insignificant compared to the problem that Luo Fan was encountering now. Of course, in contrast, the current Luo Fan was billions of times more brilliant than those ordinary mathematicians. Hence, in the face of such a problem, he didn't feel any despair at this time. He just thought about it a little, and after figuring out the difficulty of it, he began to think about how to solve this problem. However, before that, he clearly needed to clean up the entire island before anything else. After all, he started thinking about this in order to clean up the various strange things on this island. Now, even if his focus was no longer on this, he still had to finish what he started. He couldn't just give up halfway, right? Chapter 3044. After understanding the nature of the changes in the laws of this island, it was much easier to resolve the strangeness here than before. Although it was not to the extent of being able to resolve it easily, at least he no longer did not know where to start like before. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. His senses had already completely permeated the laws of this island in an instant, and he could sense every single detail of this layer of laws from the inside out. After clearly understanding that the distortions in the laws of the world also followed the framework stipulated by the Great Tao, and was also a normal evolution of this world, Luo Fan no longer treated them as distortions or anomalies. Instead, he began to observe and comprehend these laws of the world from a normal perspective. After changing his perspective, the laws of the world in his eyes naturally underwent a subtle change. Originally, he felt that everything was strange, but under this kind of perspective, the strangeness had already gradually dissipated. Vaguely, an obscure network that was originally hidden among the countless mysteries began to become clearer and clearer in his eyes. For Luo Fan, it wouldn't be too difficult to truly comprehend any of the laws of any part of the world. After all, his realm had already reached such a high level that he could even casually split the sky and earth. It was really not difficult for him to truly comprehend the laws of the world. The reason why he felt that the world that had appeared was truly strange and difficult to understand was because his perspective had not changed, and he was still using the original structure of the laws of the world to understand the new layer of laws of the world. If he used a formula to understand it, it would be very simple. In the past, it was equivalent to using a formula that did not match up at all to try to solve a rather difficult problem. In this way, the more effort he spent on the problem, the more complicated it would become, and the further away he would be from the final answer. Even if there was a tiny bit of similarity in the end, the result would seem specious, and it would not match the real answer at all. Now that he had changed his perspective, it was equivalent to directly throwing away the formula that did not match up at all and directly starting from zero, using the most clumsy method to solve the problem. In this way, it was naturally many times more troublesome than using the correct formula to solve the problem. However, this way, he could avoid the interference of the unmatched formula. Although it was troublesome, it was not wrong. As long as he kept going, it was only a matter of time before he solved that problem. In other words, the strange feeling he had towards the law layer was actually just a feeling that came from using an unmatched formula to forcibly explain the structure of the law layer. But it wasn't because the law layer was that strange, of course. Even though he could find the way by changing his perspective, it didn't mean that it was that easy. Even Luo Fan had to rely on the previous flash of inspiration to think of the key point and change his perspective. For normal cultivators, even seventh tribulation experts, it was almost impossible for them to change their perspective. After all, almost all cultivators regarded the idea that the Great Tao and the rules and laws corresponded to each other as the truth. If they did not have a preconceived notion of what the law layer of a world looked like, it was not impossible for them to find the veins behind the strangeness of that world, even though it was much more difficult than understanding the structure of the general laws and principles of an ordinary world. However, when they were already prejudiced by their first impressions, and first determined what the rules and laws of a world should look like, and then the rules and laws of that world changed into something else, revealing a strange appearance, then it would be almost impossible for them to change their mind. After all, the preconceived idea of what the law layer of the world looked like had already made them instinctively set up the corresponding formula in their mind. Under such circumstances, the law layer of the world suddenly changed. This was equivalent to directly overturning the entire problem they had already determined on the formula, and rewriting another problem to be solved with the formula. Naturally, it was a change that was almost impossible to succeed. This was the case for the seventh tribulation expert. He had already touched the law layer of the world, and had already established the so-called formula of the law layer of the world. Then, the law layer of the world suddenly changed. It jumped from this law layer of the world to another law layer that corresponded to the Great Tao, but was completely different from the original law layer of the world. This clearly caused his initial understanding of the law layer of the world to become his shackles, causing him to be completely unable to truly understand the new law layer of the world. As a result, He had always been immersed in the strangeness of the world, unable to escape. At this moment, Luo Fan directly changed his perspective. He completely abandoned his original impression of the law layer of the world, and began to slowly comprehend the law layer of the world from scratch. The appearance of the law layer of the world was something that Luo Fan had never seen before. Although he clearly knew that it was the structure of some law layer of the world that corresponded to the great Tao of this world, because it was completely unfamiliar to him, it was still extremely difficult for Luo Fan to comprehend it. It was like a radish. A normal radish was clearly plump and round, and in the knowledge of ordinary people, a radish should also look like that. In this case, they would naturally be able to recognize a normal radish at first glance. Even if it was slightly different from any radish they had seen before, they would still be able to recognize it as a radish at first glance. However, there was one time when a radish that looked like a ginseng suddenly appeared. Even if they were extremely knowledgeable and knew that there was an extremely small chance that a radish would look like this, it was still impossible for them to recognize that it was a radish at first glance. At this moment, to Luo Fan, this was the law layer of the world. The laws layer of the world that he had always been familiar with all had many similarities. The more commonly seen laws layer of the world were the easiest to appear in. However, suddenly, a special law layer of the world that could appear in laws layer of the world, but he had never seen it before, appeared in front of him. It was clearly not that easy for him to truly understand its mysteries. At this moment, the speed at which Luo Fan comprehended the laws layer of the world was unimaginably slow. This slow speed even made him feel like he had returned to the state when he had first sensed the laws layer of the world when he was still an itinerant immortal. Back then, when he first sensed the laws layer of the world, the difficulty of comprehending the laws layer of the world was already so great, and the speed at which he comprehended it was also this slow. However, although it was slow, he still made continuous progress. As time passed, his understanding of the laws layer of the world deepened, and more mysteries of the laws layer of the world appeared in his mind. In the blink of an eye, several months passed. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly chuckled. "I see." As he chuckled, his body suddenly emitted an indescribable brilliance. The brilliance directly pierced through the dimensional dojo and instantly enveloped the entire island below. As the brilliance enveloped the island, the countless strange things that originally existed on the island instantly vanished. The entire island instantly transformed into a paradise of its own, and there were no longer any strange existences to be found. Above the law layer, the brilliance also existed above the law layer where the island was located. In other words, there was a layer of brilliance that completely covered the law layer of this area. Due to the envelopment of this brilliance, the distortions that appeared in the laws layer of the area seemed to have been filtered out, and they could no longer be of any use on the island. Under the filtering of this brilliance, the laws layer of the area seemed to have completely returned to the normal state that Luo Fan had first seen. It was as if nothing had happened before. Following this change, the living beings on the island suddenly felt their bodies and minds relax. The heavy feeling that had been weighing down on their hearts suddenly disappeared without a trace. It must be noted that the true strangeness did not happen to the living beings that had died or been completely distorted by the strangeness. Even the living beings that were not truly affected would also experience all sorts of subtle changes due to the true strangeness. Perhaps those living beings did not have the ability to clearly grasp these changes. However, as living beings, they could still instinctively sense their own changes. To them, this feeling had turned into a heavy feeling that was pressing down on their hearts. This heavy feeling was similar to the subtle uneasiness of knowing that he had forgotten something, but he didn't know what he had forgotten. At this moment, as the distortions in the laws layer were filtered out by the brilliance that Luo Fan released, the changes to the living beings naturally disappeared. With the disappearance of the changes, they naturally sensed it instinctively, and the heavy feeling naturally disappeared. "Is it over?" These were the thoughts that appeared in the minds of those living beings at this moment. For a moment, the feeling of returning from death made them feel like the sky had cleared up after the rain. Luo Fan did not care about the living beings' relief at all. Although it took him a long time to get rid of the strangeness of the island over the past few months, he did not feel that it was a waste of time at all. After all, the final result was rather useful to him. In fact, it could even be said that it was a rare gain. The brilliance that he released at this moment, which filtered out the distortions, was actually his most basic understanding of the corresponding relationship between the great Tao and the law's layer, or in other words, the correlation function. Of course, this was still extremely far from a true correlation function. Even the difference between the heavens and the earth was not enough to describe the difference between the brilliance and the correlation function. The brilliance that he released at this moment was actually only formed from his understanding of the source of the sudden change in the law's layer. Its effect was at most slightly deflecting the distortions in the law's layer. After all, the change in the law's layer of this world was only a tiny bit. It was like a gigantic object had moved a few millimeters. If one did not observe carefully, one would not even be able to tell that it had moved. Although the effect of this slight movement was quite shocking, it was only a slight movement in the end. Since it was a slight movement, it would not be difficult to figure out the difference between the two positions. At this moment, the brilliance that Luo Fan released was the result of his understanding of the difference between the two. This brilliance was not enough to support Luo Fan's thorough study of the relationship between the law's layer and the great Tao, but it was clearly not completely useless. At the very least, it allowed Luo Fan to generally confirm that his previous understanding was correct. The relationship between the great Tao and the law's layer was indeed, as he had thought before. There was indeed a correlation function. With a slight thought, Luo Fan turned his head to look into the distance, at the place where the seventh tribulation powerhouse had fallen. At this moment, that place was still like a natural moat. Worlds and spacetime were constantly being born from it, and then they were constantly being devoured by the surrounding void. Or rather, they were being devoured by this world. During this process, this world was still constantly changing, and the true strangeness in the eyes of ordinary cultivators was also becoming more and more obvious. Of course, this true strangeness was only in the eyes of ordinary cultivators. In the eyes of Luo Fan, who already knew the true source of this strangeness, this was just a manifestation of the law's layer of this world constantly transitioning to another structure. If this goes on, I'm afraid it will become more and more difficult for him to transcend. Will he really die because of this? Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable doubt in his heart. If the seventh tribulation powerhouse really died, the result would be too depressing. After thinking about it, he still shook his head. Probably not. Although I don't know if that person is a disciple of a Tao master, as a seventh tribulation powerhouse, he will eventually have a trump card. If his life is really threatened, he will definitely have some means to escape. Moreover, this is also a land of opportunity, not an ordinary world. After all, it is impossible for him to be merciless. Chapter 30-45. After making up his mind, Luo Fan calmly watched from the sidelines. In any case, this seventh tribulation powerhouse was a complete stranger to him. The other party's life and death had nothing to do with him. In that case, as long as there was a small reason, he would naturally be able to ignore everything that had happened to him with a peace of mind. After watching from the sidelines with a peace of mind, he began to think about what he should do next. Now, one of his small goals was to figure out the correlation function between the great Tao and the laws and laws. By figuring out this correlation function, his worldview of laws would become more complete and perfect. If he wanted to figure out the correlation function, he would naturally need a large amount of data to be able to sort it out. As for the data, it was the creation of different worlds under the same great Tao in different locations and at different times. For Luo Fan, it meant that other worlds obviously couldn't achieve the same fixed and unchanging great Tao as his world of laws. Naturally, there was no point in using it as a reference. What was even more obvious was that if he just unfolded his world of laws here, even if it was at different times, it wouldn't be enough to really figure out the correlation function. He had to unfold it in different locations, Luo Fan thought to himself. He first turned his gaze to the many places of opportunity that he had sensed through the common technique that connected many places of opportunity. Although the number of places of opportunity wasn't infinite, it was still an unimaginably large number. If he could unfold his world of laws in every place of opportunity and then integrate the data within, it might be barely enough as long as he could cover all the places of opportunity. Of course, at the same time, the unfolding at different times had to be carried out simultaneously. If that was the case, he would need to unleash countless times more laws of heaven and earth among the numerous lands of opportunity. Thinking about the consequences of doing so, Luo Fan decisively rejected this option in his heart. After all, that was a place of opportunity. As a place of opportunity, it was simply unimaginable what would happen in it. Just like the land of opportunity in front of him, although Luo Fan himself had obtained many benefits here, and even used this side of the world to comprehend the more complex corresponding relationship between the great Tao and the law layer, it was still not enough. However, that was not inevitable. From the encounter of the seventh tribulation powerhouse, it could be seen that this land of opportunity actually had its risk. Moreover, if he was not careful, the risk could even threaten his life. If this was the case for this land of fortuitous encounters, would other similar lands of fortuitous encounters be different in nature? In other words, if this land of fortuitous opportunities had such a risk, the risk of other land of fortuitous opportunities would definitely not be lower than this one. Even if it was Luo Fan, he could easily endure one land of fortune, 2 lands, 3 lands, 10 lands, 100 lands, 1,000 lands, or even 10,000 lands. What about 3 lands? What about the 100 million points? Obviously, no matter how confident he was, Luo Fan was not arrogant enough to think that he could easily avoid all the risks in the land of opportunity that was opened up by a true sage. In this way, if he regarded the almost countless land of fortuitous opportunities as the place where the world of laws was opened up, then it was almost certain that he would definitely fall into some kind of inexplicable danger in one of the land of fortuitous opportunities because of the special mechanism of the land of fortuitous opportunities. This kind of danger that he would inevitably encounter might appear in countless ways, and there might even be some dangers that he couldn't guarantee that his real body would not be affected even if he entered with his incarnation. Therefore, if he made such a choice, it would be equivalent to directly throwing himself into the boundless ocean without even a boat to obtain a drop of water. Obviously, the risks taken and the rewards obtained were absolutely not proportional. Luo Fan's thoughts turned quickly. He had already gone through these situations in his heart, so it was naturally impossible for him to choose those land of fortuitous opportunities as the place where the world of laws was opened up. Fortunately, even if he did not have those land of fortuitous opportunities, he still had another choice. This choice was none other than the Tao Master Path. This situation seemed incredible. After all, there were only 9 levels on the road to becoming a Tao Master, and he had only touched less than half of them. If he wanted to find an almost infinite number of different places to open up the world of laws, it seemed that he couldn't find any space in it. However, don't forget that there were more details in each level of the Tao Master's path. Among them, the most obvious was that in the 6th level of the Tao Master Path, where his main body was, there might be countless layers of the ocean of nothingness that he could choose from. The void ocean layer was an existence similar to the primal chaos in the state of primal chaos. Perhaps it was far inferior to the true primal chaos, but each layer of the void ocean layer was more than enough to replace a part of the world. In other words, if he chose the 6th level of the Tao Master Path, He only needed to enter as many layers of the ocean of nothingness as possible with his incarnation, and he would naturally be able to find as many different places as possible to open up his world of laws and obtain the data he needed. Of course, all of this was just a guess. As for the specifics, he naturally had to experiment. It would be best if the ocean of nothingness worked, but if it didn't, then he would just have to think of other ways. After all, if one really had to choose those places of opportunity, apart from the risks mentioned above, it would be rather troublesome just to enter those places of opportunity. At the very least, apart from needing to extract the specific method to enter a certain place of fortune from the general method, there might even be some places of fortune that might be sealed, and it might not be a place that a cultivator at the 6th level of the Tao Sovereign's path could come into contact with, and so on and so forth. There were practically countless troubles. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's incarnations walked out of his main body in the heavens on the 6th level of the Tao Master Path. As soon as the clones emerged, they used the technique he learned from the prisoners imprisoned by the middle-aged woman to travel through different layers of the void ocean and headed towards the layers of the void ocean. The number of the ocean of nothingness in the ocean of nothingness could almost be said to be endless. Even the number of ocean of nothingness that his incarnation could overlook would need to be counted in the billions to barely count. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine the terrifying number of clones he would need if he wanted to have his clones in every nothingness layer. At this moment, Luo Fan's real body produced incarnations one after another, and even formed a river of incarnations around his body that constantly flowed in all directions outside the heavens. Because there were just too many incarnations, these incarnations even covered the sky and filled a larger and larger area of the heavens. The heavens were obviously closely related to Luo Fan's worldview of laws. Now that Luo Fan had a better understanding of the appearance of the world of laws, the heavens naturally began to produce all kinds of subtle changes. Although the changes were only at the beginning, the changes were already quite obvious. The entire heavens became more and more diverse and complicated amid the changes. It felt like an unfolding book had suddenly become thicker by countless times, and the content that could be unfolded had increased by countless times. However, at this moment, when Luo Fan created the massive number of incarnations, even the more complicated changes in the heavens became inconspicuous. At this moment, if someone could see the heavens from a macro perspective, the first thing they would notice would definitely be the group of incarnations of Luo Fan in the center of the heavens. The endless incarnations were constantly spawning and expanding like a nebula that was getting wider and wider. Even though a large number of incarnations were constantly disappearing from the edge of the nebula and entering a certain layer of the ocean of nothingness, it did not change the fact that the nebula was constantly expanding. The speed at which the incarnations were created was much faster than the speed at which they disappeared from the heavens. Even so, Luo Fan did not have any intention of stopping and waiting for the incarnations to leave the heavens. This was because he knew very well that these incarnations were still several orders of magnitude away from what he wanted, which was to cover every layer of the ocean of nothingness. Even if he created the incarnations at this speed and threw them into the ocean of nothingness, it might still take a long time to complete the entire creation process. Under such circumstances, how could he have the time to waste waiting for the incarnations to leave the heavens? In any case, no matter how big his incarnation nebula was in the heavens, as long as he stopped creating the incarnations, all the incarnations would disappear in a few breaths. The entire nebula would disappear completely. After all, these incarnations all had the thoughts of Luo Fan and a part of his strength. It was extremely easy for such existences to cross the heavens. Even if there were countless incarnations obstructing them from all directions, they could easily leave the heavens and enter a certain layer of the ocean of nothingness in a few breaths. As the embodiment nebula continued to expand, Luo Fan's embodiment had already started to enter the vast layer of the void ocean. Of course, at the same time, a large number of incarnations began to unfold his world of laws in the layers of the ocean of nothingness. From the fact that Luo Fan didn't hesitate to create more incarnations and throw them into the ocean of nothingness, one could tell that the results of the experiment were quite perfect. The effect of unfolding the world of laws in different layers of the ocean of nothingness was no different from unfolding the world of laws in different layers of the ocean of nothingness. In fact, compared to unfolding the world of laws in different layers of the ocean of nothingness, there was an unexpected benefit to unfolding the world of laws in different layers of the ocean of nothingness. That was, as the layers of the ocean of nothingness differed, there was a vague law that existed in all the worlds of laws that were unfolded. This law was extremely subtle, but it was a law that was formed by the subtle changes that occurred in different layers of the ocean of nothingness. In other words, as the layers of the ocean of nothingness changed, the situation of the world of laws would also change. Moreover, the closer the layers of the ocean of nothingness were, the more obvious the correlation between the changes. Although it was not to the extent that the worlds of laws that were separated by two layers of the ocean of nothingness were extremely similar, as if there were only slight changes between the two, the obvious correlation made it difficult for anyone to completely separate the worlds of laws from each other. In this case, it's obviously easier to figure out the law of laws. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and an inexplicable joy arose from the bottom of his heart. With such a subtle law existing, it was obviously much easier for him to figure out the correlation function between the great Tao and the law layer. In the beginning, Luo Fan's behavior naturally did not attract the attention of any cultivators. However, as time passed, as his incarnations appeared in more and more layers of the ocean of nothingness, his behavior became more and more obvious, and finally, some cultivators began to notice his behavior. Among them, the first to notice his behavior was obviously Taoist Hongqua, who was the most familiar with Luo Fan on the 6th floor of the Tao Master's path. On this day, Taoist Hongqua occasionally glanced at the shallower layers of the ocean of nothingness, and he immediately saw a familiar figure in each layer of the ocean of nothingness. He could not help but be slightly stunned. Glancing at the shallower layers of the ocean of nothingness from the deeper layers of the ocean of nothingness was like glancing at the surface of a planet in space. Although it was theoretically possible to see everything on the planet clearly, because the range of vision was too large, it was quite difficult to really notice something on the planet. Unless the existence was too conspicuous and grand, it would be impossible to notice it at a glance. Therefore, in the past, Taoist Hongqua completely did not notice that Luo Fan was cultivating in the shallower layers of the ocean of nothingness. Even though he clearly knew that Luo Fan must be cultivating in the shallower layers of the ocean of nothingness. However, the situation was obviously different this time. There was a certain existence in a certain layer of the ocean of nothingness, and there was a certain existence in almost all the layers of the ocean of nothingness. It was like comparing a grain of sand on the surface of a planet to the great wall of countless grains of sand. The former would definitely be ignored, but the latter could be identified with just a little attention. Chapter 3046. What kind of cultivation is this? Taoist Hongqua looked at the many clones of Luo Fan that existed in the shallow layers of the ocean of nothingness and couldn't help but feel puzzled. However, he quickly tossed this doubt aside. As for asking Luo Fan, he naturally would not do such a thing. Although he had a rather good relationship with Luo Fan, it didn't mean that he could inquire about all of Luo Fan's secrets, especially the secrets related to cultivation. At this time, Luo Fan didn't explain it, which meant that this kind of cultivation had nothing to do with him. In that case, it was naturally not appropriate for him to ask too much. Taoist Hongqua didn't ask Luo Fan what kind of cultivation method it was, and he just pretended not to see it. Other cultivators couldn't do the same. After all, the commotion caused by Luo Fan was too great. throwing his clones into almost all the observable layers of the ocean of nothingness, and then letting these clones build a world of laws that belonged to him was simply equivalent to forcefully piling up fine sand on a planet to build a great wall. Any cultivator with the slightest bit of attention would be able to clearly notice such a change. There was no need to say what their first thought would be when they suddenly saw an extremely clear and prominent landmark in a place that was originally hazy. They would definitely get closer to that place and see it more clearly before doing anything else. At that moment, more and more cultivators began to appear around the projection of the world of laws that Luo Fan's clones had unfolded in the layers of the ocean of nothingness. These cultivators naturally couldn't directly come forward to communicate with Luo Fan's clones at first. After all, they didn't know anything. They didn't know whether the projection of the world of laws was dangerous or whether the existence that constructed it was easy to talk to. Under such circumstances, how could they recklessly charge forward before figuring out what was going on? However, the increase of companions would obviously greatly increase the confidence of living beings. Even powerhouses who had undergone 6 tribulations were no exception. As more and more powerhouses gathered around the world of laws, the scruples in the hearts of these powerhouses unknowingly became smaller and smaller. Even though their understanding of the projection of the world of law and Luo Fan, who had constructed it, was still very shallow, it was the same. Therefore, in a certain layer of the nothingness ocean, when the number of 6th tribulation powerhouses gathered around Luo Fan's world of laws increased to tens of thousands, some of the cultivators finally began to take action to probe the world of laws projection. Their worries were completely suppressed by the increase in their companions. Even if the existence of the world of law had nothing to do with them, the 6th tribulation expert had the appearance of an old man. His appearance gave off a sage-like aura. At this moment, he didn't even have the thought of speaking. He raised his hand and pointed at the illusory figure of the world of laws. As he pointed, a beam of light directly rushed out from his hand, distorting and changing in the void, faintly forming pieces of space and time, quickly colliding with the illusory figure of the world of laws. Buzz, 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 a bell-like sound rang out the moment the beam of light collided with the illusory figure of the world of laws. The illusory figure of the world of laws distorted intensely during the collision, looking as if it would collapse at any time. The beam of light completely collapsed during the collision, turning into endless light fragments and disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. As the beam of light disappeared, the illusory figure of the world of laws also calmed down, as if nothing had happened before. Seeing this scene, the expressions of the surrounding powerhouses turned solemn. Although the attack that the old man had launched just now was just a probing attack, as a 6th tribulation powerhouse, even a probing attack wasn't simple. Even an existence at the peak of the 6th tribulation would have to use some means to defend against such an attack. It was only normal for them to do so. But what was the situation before? Before this, the illusory figure of the world of laws had completely ignored the attack. It was an illusion of heaven and earth that directly withstood such an attack. What did this mean? This almost meant that the existence that constructed the illusory figure of the world of laws had a 70 to 80% chance of surpassing the peak 6th tribulation powerhouse, in other words, the existence of a 7th tribulation powerhouse. Obviously, as 6th tribulation powerhouses, these powerhouses didn't have much confidence in facing a 7th tribulation powerhouse. It was precisely because of this that they had such a solemn expression at this time. Of course, at this time, they were more rejoicing that they didn't make a move to probe. They couldn't be more clear about the concept of an existence of the 7th tribulation powerhouse. It could be said that even if they had tens of thousands of 6th tribulation powerhouses here, including many peak 6th tribulation powerhouses, they wouldn't stand a chance against a 7th tribulation powerhouse. If that 7th tribulation expert wanted to, he only needed to think about it, and he didn't even need to make a move, and he could wipe out all of them. I still have something to do, so I'll take my leave first. The cultivators who knew each other greeted each other at this time, then turned around and left. Obviously, they planned to leave this place that might be a place of trouble. The other powerhouses could understand that they could leave, but the sage-like old man broke out in cold sweat at this time. How is this possible? How can a seventh tribulation powerhouse be so high-profile after going against the heavens? Even the Tao Master's prison doesn't care? At this time, only such thoughts kept surging in his mind. Although it seemed that he had rashly probed before, in fact, as a sixth tribulation powerhouse, he had also thought about it before doing so. After thinking about it, he roughly confirmed that the risk was within his acceptable range. Then he directly launched an attack to probe the powerhouse in the center. And after thinking about it, the conclusion he got was that the existence that constructed this heaven and earth shadow, no matter how strong it was, would not be a fatal threat to him. Although this sage-like old man was a little rash compared to other sixth tribulation powerhouses, his cultivation realm had directly reached the peak of the sixth tribulation powerhouse. This kind of strength made him think that other than seventh tribulation powerhouses who could pose a threat to him, even the peak of the sixth tribulation powerhouse would not have much of an advantage over him. It was because of this confidence that he directly attacked so rashly just now. Otherwise, no matter what, he would have asked about it first before doing anything. As for why he judged that the existence that created this heaven and earth shadow was only at the level of a sixth tribulation powerhouse, there was no need to explain. That was completely based on Luo Fan's performance. For the cultivators who walked the right path, the existence of the Tao Master's path was like a layer of guidance. Generally speaking, to break through to a certain level, one needed to step into a certain level of the Tao Master's path to achieve a perfect breakthrough. Therefore, normally speaking, a seventh tribulation powerhouse could only naturally be in the seventh level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, if a seventh tribulation expert appeared on the sixth floor of the road of Tao Master, he would obviously be going against the road of Tao Master and violating the fundamental rules of the road of Tao Master. It was an act that would inevitably trigger the Tao Master prison. In this case, any seventh tribulation powerhouse who appeared in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path would not be too high profile, even if he did not tuck his tail between his legs and tried his best to hide himself. And now, how could Luo Fan's performance be described as high profile? He was simply trying to attract the attention of all the cultivators in the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. If such an action really happened to a seventh tribulation powerhouse who walked the right path, it would be like asking for the power of the Tao Master's prison to suppress him. Precisely because of this, the sage-like elder immediately ruled out the possibility that Luo Fan was a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Instead, he directly believed that no matter how strong he was only a sixth tribulation powerhouse. However, the current situation was quite clear. This time, he had really kicked an iron plate, although he did not know why. The existence that created the heaven and earth shadow in the countless levels of the nothingness ocean was actually a seventh tribulation powerhouse, and he had just attacked the other party rudely for no reason. It's over, it's over. At this time, the elder only kept repeating these two words in his heart. Just then, a voice came from the heaven and earth shadow, "Since you're here, stay." As the voice spoke, the heaven and earth shadow instantly expanded, and in the blink of an eye, it had already expanded to tens of thousands of times its original size. It felt like the original heaven and earth shadow was compressed into a solid balloon, but at this time, it seemed like the solid balloon had directly turned into a gaseous state. The speed of this expansion had reached a level beyond the imagination of an ordinary sixth tribulation powerhouse. Those sixth tribulation powerhouses did not even have time to react before they were completely engulfed by the heaven and earth shadow. This change was not only caused by the heaven and earth shadow in the nothingness ocean layer. Instead, the heaven and earth shadow in every level of the nothingness ocean layer was experiencing the same change. In that instant, regardless of whether they did anything hostile to the world of laws, the illusory figure of the world of laws would directly devour them and bring them into the illusory figure of the world of laws. Because the speed was simply too fast, not a single sixth tribulation powerhouse could even make a sound during this process. It seemed like they had been silently swallowed by the heaven and earth shadow. Along with this change, the surroundings of the world silhouette cleared up, and it seemed as if nothing had happened. When those sixth tribulation powerhouses entered the heaven and earth shadow, they were also assimilated by the heaven and earth shadow and directly turned into the appearance of the heaven and earth shadow. Of course, compared to the living beings in the heaven and earth shadow, they were still a little more real. After all, the nature of the two was ultimately different. The many living beings in the heaven and earth shadow were just some kind of illusory evolution, and they were not really real. In contrast, although those sixth tribulation powerhouses looked like a shadow, they were still fundamentally real. The appearance of this phantom was at most like another form of their bodies. This difference was huge in nature. But at this time, in this illusory world of laws, their performance was exactly the same. There was no difference at all. The heaven and earth treated the sixth tribulation powerhouses the same way it treated the living beings' shadows. Similarly, the sixth tribulation powerhouses would have the same reaction to the heaven and earth shadow as the living beings' shadows did to the heaven and earth shadow. "We didn't offend you. Why did you attack us?" Compared to the other sixth tribulation powerhouses in the nothingness ocean layer, who were confused by Luo Fan's sudden change of heart, the sixth tribulation powerhouses in the same layer as the sage-like old man roared angrily in the heaven and earth shadow. All the cultivators who were sucked into the heaven and earth shadow did not appear where the main body of the heaven and earth was. Instead, they appeared in the parallel locations of the main body of the heaven and earth that were derived from the heaven and earth shadow. Of course, this was only for existences with a macroscopic perspective. For those sixth tribulation powerhouses, although they were not completely immersed in the illusions of the world of laws, it was still difficult for them to see through the situation in the parallel spaces. Therefore, at this time, the sixth tribulation powerhouses were constantly searching the parallel locations they were in with their perception, trying to find the creator of the heaven and earth shadow, which was Luo Fan. No matter how strange the heaven and earth shadow was, at the end of the day, they all had a creator. The best way to get out of this heaven and earth was obviously to find the creator of this heaven and earth. After finding him, whether it was negotiating with him or fighting him, that was something to be done after finding him. However, whether it was negotiating or fighting, it was obvious that they had to find the creator of the heaven and earth shadow first. However, they didn't even know where they were, so how could they possibly find Luo Fan's existence? Compared to the other cultivators in the nothingness ocean layer, the sixth tribulation powerhouses in the same layer as the sage-like old man had an additional choice at this time, and that was to wait for Luo Fan's answer. However, their wait was destined to be in vain. Luo Fan didn't absorb them into the illusory figure of the world of laws to vent his anger, but to cultivate. This could be seen from the fact that he did not attack the sage-like old man or the sixth tribulation powerhouses in the same layer as the sage-like old man. Instead, he directly attacked all the sixth tribulation powerhouses surrounding the heaven and earth shadow in the countless layers of the nothingness ocean layer. Chapter 3047. Sucking many sixth tribulation powerhouses into the projection of the world of laws was equivalent to throwing a mixer into a pond. Their existence alone was enough to cause great pressure on the projection of the world of laws. In addition, they would inevitably take various measures to crack it, which would have an impact on the projection of the world of laws. These effects were enough to cause many changes in the laws of the world of laws that couldn't be seen before. It was just like what was at the bottom of a pond. Whether it was mud or sand, one had to stir it to see. Although the entire pond might become turbid after stirring it, it was still just a projection. No matter what, the world of laws was just a projection, and everything derived from it was just a projection. Luo Fan only needed a thought to easily smooth out all the changes. Naturally, he didn't need to care about what the world of laws would become because of these sixth tribulation powerhouses. After all, no matter what, he'd constructed the projections of numerous heavens and earth of laws for the sake of using them as materials to comprehend the related functions between the grand Tao and the law layer. In his heart, the world of laws was already a consumable. Most of the sixth tribulation powerhouses were extremely smart, and they naturally saw through Luo Fan's intentions at a glance. Even though they were sucked into the projection of the world of laws, they didn't resent the sage-like sixth tribulation powerhouse. However, it was obvious that since there was a majority, there was naturally a small portion. Among them, there was a small portion of them who, due to various reasons, directly placed their resentment on the sage-like sixth tribulation powerhouse. They believed that it was because of him that they were sucked into the illusory world of laws and were unable to escape. Of course, perhaps some sixth tribulation powerhouses didn't really think that it was the sage-like sixth tribulation powerhouse's fault. They just needed such a person to vent their anger, which was why they placed their resentment on him. At this moment, the sage-like old man was both relaxed and panicking. Not everyone had the courage to fight against hundreds of millions of fellow Taoists at the same time. Luo Fan could directly absorb all the cultivators around the countless world of laws into his world of laws. He wasn't afraid of offending the hundreds of millions of sixth tribulation powerhouses. This was because he was confident that he could easily suppress such a large number of sixth tribulation powerhouses with his strength. In comparison, the old man who was only at the peak of the sixth tribulation clearly did not have this kind of confidence. To him, even if there were 8 to 10 experts in the surroundings glaring at him with hatred, he would still be on tenterhooks all the time. The current situation was that the majority of the experts who had surrounded the illusory figure had already seen through the nature of the matter and no longer viewed him with hatred. However, he could not avoid the fact that some cultivators would treat him as the source of their suffering. Moreover, there were definitely more than 8 or 10 cultivators who regarded him as the source of their bad luck. Most people didn't resent him for it, which made him feel relieved. However, an extremely small portion of them would resent him, and this made him feel uncontrollable panic. I have to leave this illusory figure as soon as possible. The old man immediately made his decision. For other powerhouses, the enemies who entered this illusory figure were only the illusory figure and the creator behind it. However, for him, apart from these two, the more important ones were his companions who had entered this illusory figure with him. Since the illusory figure had pulled them in, it definitely wouldn't let them die so easily. At the very least, judging from the current situation, the illusory figure wouldn't let them die so easily. However, it was different for his companions. They definitely wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. Even if not all of his companions felt the same way, this didn't change the fact that any powerhouse he encountered in the future would think the same way. Although it was just an illusory figure, these sixth tribulation powerhouses had already been transformed into illusory figures after entering it. Illusory figures were illusory figures, and the surrounding world was no different from the real world. If one wanted to transcend the illusions of this world and break away from the illusions of this world, it would be the same as breaking away from a part of the world, a part of the real world. Although the power of a sixth tribulation powerhouse was rather incredible, it wasn't difficult for him to transcend the normal world, even if it was a big world. However, at this moment, he didn't have much confidence in facing this illusory figure. He didn't think that his transcendence from this world would be so smooth. Even if he didn't know what methods the Creator had, how could the Creator not know the methods of so many sixth tribulation powerhouses? Since he knew their methods, but he still sent them into this illusory figure. It clearly showed that he had a way to deal with them and restrict them in this illusory figure. Although the old man still didn't know what methods the Creator had to restrict them, this didn't stop him from recognizing the existence of such methods. At this moment, the old man didn't casually use his power to break through this illusory figure. If he didn't have enemies and other companions eyeing him covetously, he would definitely do this. However, if this didn't exist, any other sixth tribulation powerhouse could be an enemy that wanted to get rid of him. Even if he didn't know why those powerhouses still hadn't taken action or whether they were in this world, he didn't dare to reveal his existence to the world. However, although he couldn't forcefully break through the restrictions of this world and transcend, it didn't mean that he couldn't transcend this world. Since he couldn't use brute force to transcend, he naturally had to use techniques to transcend. At this moment, he concealed all of his presence and began to honestly understand the world. He resided in the way an ordinary cultivator would. If he wanted to use techniques to transcend this world, the best way was of course to use the most perfect method that existed in this world. The transcendence method that existed in this world was naturally the most suitable for this world, and it was the easiest way to transcend. In this case, the possibility of this transcendence method being the smallest was the highest. Moreover, if he used the transcendence method that existed in this world, it was very likely that he could hide among the other transcendents. In that case, even if he made a big noise, the other sixth tribulation powerhouses might not notice him. A few days later, the old man was so scared that he almost wet his pants. How is this possible? How can there be so many sixth tribulation powerhouses in this world? Did I express it wrong or did I misunderstand it? After thinking about all the information he had received in the past few days, he couldn't believe what he had seen. Through his many inquiries, he discovered that the most powerful cultivator in this part of the world had actually far surpassed his original expectations. Through various descriptions, he felt that the cultivator's strength was actually a bit stronger than his own. If only one or two people had said this, he would naturally think that those who gave him the information had limited knowledge and could not clearly know what kind of strength and methods an expert at his level had. However, since he didn't trust this information, he didn't just inquire about a few sources of information. Instead, he inquired about almost all the sources of information he could find. He even went to the places where the most powerful experts were said to have used their methods in order to carefully sense them. But everything was pointing to the fact that the news was true. There were indeed sixth tribulation powerhouses in this world, and there was not just one, but thousands of them. How could he not be shocked by this situation? Don't tell me that they have been given identities. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility, and his eyes lit up. If these sixth tribulation powerhouses were not born and raised in this world, but had been given identities by the sixth tribulation powerhouses who had entered this world with him, then everything seemed to make sense. Obviously, if this was the case, the situation would be worse than if the sixth tribulation powerhouses were born and raised in this world. However, the old man hoped that this was the case. The reason why he said that the situation would be worse if those sixth tribulation experts were outsiders was because to this old man, any outsider could become his enemy and might want to get rid of him as soon as possible. The cultivators who wanted to get rid of him did not have any status or power in this world. These were obviously two completely different concepts, and the degree of danger was also completely different. Even so, the reason why he hoped that was the case was not complicated. If this was the case, then it meant that this world did not exceed his understanding. Everything in this world was still within the scope of his understanding. In this case, the possible dangers in this world were also within the scope of his understanding, and it was naturally easier for him to deal with such dangers. However, if it was the other way around, the situation would obviously be completely different. Perhaps at any time, he would suffer an unimaginable disaster due to some factors that he could not think of at all. It was precisely because of this that he hoped that the outsiders had been given identities. If they've been given an identity, then the various legends they have in this world should be in line with their personalities. Since there were two possibilities, he naturally had to confirm which one was true. If he wanted to confirm which one was true, he naturally had to first come into contact with those sixth tribulation powerhouses. If it was other sixth tribulation powerhouses, there was no need to think too much. He could just directly ask for an audience. However, when it came to this old man, he first had to confirm that this sixth tribulation powerhouse was not the sixth tribulation powerhouse that might have a grudge against him. He had collected the legends of those sixth tribulation powerhouses. Through those legends, he had deduced their personalities with great difficulty. He had tried his best to eliminate those who were more irritable and used violent methods to solve problems. Although he was in a somewhat sorry state, this old man was still a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Even in this strange world, he was an existence that belonged to the strongest level. If he wanted to collect information like this, even if it was hidden in endless illusions and was regarded as the inheritance secret of a large family or a large force, he could still easily find it. Therefore, after a few days, the information he had collected was probably comparable to that of the large forces that truly specialized in history in this world. Through this information, he finally picked out a sixth tribulation powerhouse that was the least likely to hate him from the hundreds and thousands of sixth tribulation powerhouses. If she really is the kind of cultivator that will treat me as the source of her bad luck, then I'll accept it. The old man confirmed the candidate for the last time and thought fiercely in his heart. According to the legends, the sixth tribulation powerhouse he had chosen was the embodiment of all beauty and was the representative of reason. It was said that even when facing ordinary people, she could actually treat them equally. Even if someone had wronged her, she would definitely be willing to stand in the other party's shoes and think for them. There was naturally a difference between legends and reality. At the very least, it had to be discounted. However, no matter how discounted it was enough to satisfy the old man's needs. After making his decision, the old man immediately went to the dojo of the sixth tribulation powerhouse and knocked on the door to ask for an audience. As a sixth tribulation powerhouse, it was naturally impossible for him to be like an ordinary person and just build a manor somewhere and live in it. Although this world was very receptive to sixth tribulation powerhouses, and those sixth tribulation powerhouses wouldn't easily cause damage to this world, as sixth tribulation powerhouses were still too powerful. However, as a sixth tribulation expert, he was still too powerful. Even an unconscious spiritual fluctuation was enough to cause shocking damage to the surrounding world. Therefore, most sixth tribulation powerhouses would obviously open up their own dojo and hide themselves in the depths of the world. This was the same for the sixth tribulation powerhouse that the old man had chosen. Therefore, the location of the sixth tribulation powerhouse that he had found was only a spatial connection point. Of course, since he was the strongest powerhouse in this world, this spatial connection point naturally couldn't be empty. It was a special place in space. There was a projection of a dojo in this place. Apart from it being a projection, it looked similar to the real dojo of the sixth tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, the old man did not knock on the door like an ordinary person would. Instead, he used his own power to directly penetrate the spatial connection point and directly touch the real dojo. Chapter 3048. No matter what, a sixth tribulation powerhouse was an existence that stood at the peak of this world. How could the master of the dojo not receive such an existence who had come to pay a visit, and an unfamiliar one at that? Was he not afraid of offending someone who could have been friends with him? As a result, the old man was quickly brought into the true dojo. Although the projection of this world was only a projection, everything in it seemed real. Even the cultivators in it were in accordance with the logic of this world. At least, in the eyes of these cultivators, they had started cultivating and improving themselves bit by bit from an ordinary person. In the end, it took them billions of years to achieve the strength of a sixth-tribulation powerhouse. Such an existence naturally had its own temperament and logic. Meeting with the old man, they exchanged greetings, probed, questioned, communicated, and so on. However, although the conversation went smoothly, the sixth-tribulation powerhouse was quite surprised by the old man's arrival. The reason for that was because the old man's behavior was simply too strange. He had clearly come to visit, but after meeting, he seemed a little distracted. It was as if his mind was not on the conversation at all. If it was an ordinary woman, she would have suspected that the old man was distracted by her appearance and temperament. However, it was obvious that although this sixth-tribulation powerhouse had the appearance of an extremely outstanding woman, she was still a sixth-tribulation powerhouse. As for whether other powerhouses were distracted because of her, she was very clear. The old man in front of her was clearly not distracted because of her, but because of something else. However, this sixth-tribulation powerhouse was worthy of being an existence who had left countless good names in this world. She was quite tolerant of the old man's unreasonable behavior. He did not blame the other party for this, but because the other party was not interested in continuing to communicate with him, he did not want to waste the other party's time. After a few casual words, he ended the topic, gave the old man a way out, and left. The old man left the dojo in a daze, and his heart sank. She's actually not an outsider. She's actually a powerhouse who was born and raised in this world. How is this possible? This is just a world, and it's not even a perfect world. How can such a powerhouse be nurtured? Could it be that she's the only one who isn't? This thought flashed through his mind, and a strong sense of unease welled up in his heart. At this point, this world became even more mysterious and dangerous in his eyes. Although he was still trying to find an excuse for himself, he already understood that these sixth-tribulation experts were actually born and raised in this illusory world. Even if he wasn't, the fact that the expert he was visiting was already meant that this illusionary world had the ability to give birth to a sixth-tribulation expert. The mysteriousness and danger of this illusionary world was naturally no different from the fact that all the sixth-tribulation experts were born and raised here. After a long time, the old man regained his composure and began to ponder. Could it be that they've discovered this? That's why they haven't made a move? During these past few days, he'd been constantly searching through this illusory world, yet he couldn't even find a single fellow Taoist that had been absorbed into this illusory world. If he hadn't seen those fellow Taoists being absorbed into this world when he was absorbed into this illusory world, he might have suspected that he was the only one that had been absorbed into this illusory world. Previously, he could still convince himself that they had already obtained the identity of this world's illusory world. But now this explanation was clearly not valid. No, even if they've hidden themselves, it's impossible for them to not leave any traces. Take me for example, no matter how careful I am, there are still traces left behind. If I were to search for them myself, I would definitely be able to find these traces. With so many people, it's impossible for them to not leave any traces. If that's the case, this world's illusory world isn't just the world that I'm in, the old man pondered. If it was in the past, he would definitely overturn this possibility when he thought of this. After all, this was a world's illusory world. How could there be more than one world's illusory world within this world's illusory world? However, it was very clear that after he discovered that there were a large number of native sixth-tribulation powerhouses in this world's illusory world, how could he not understand the uniqueness of this world? Since this world's illusory world could actually nurture cultivators at the level of sixth-tribulation powerhouses, then it didn't seem surprising that there were more world's illusory worlds embedded within it. If that's the case, just transcending this world might not be able to truly break away from this world's illusory world. The old man frowned. Compared to before, he was a lot more relaxed now. There were no other outsiders in this world's illusory world, which meant that even if he made a big move here, he wouldn't be discovered by them. In this way, it seemed that there was no need to use overly complicated methods to transcend this world. Of course, although he was a little more relaxed, he didn't dare to say that he was unscrupulous. After all, there were native sixth tribulation powerhouses in this world's illusory world. If he was too unscrupulous and touched any of their taboos, they wouldn't be polite to him. At that time, he would have made unnecessary enemies and brought unnecessary trouble to himself. Therefore, even though he could transcend this world's illusory world without too many worries, it still took him half a month to complete the preparations for transcending. One of the preparations was to choose a place to transcend. This world's illusory world was quite prosperous, and the number of living beings in it was unimaginable. The next method he planned to use to transcend would cause a relatively large commotion. If he didn't care about the environment, his transcendence might cause a large number of deaths and injuries. If he really did that, it would be like asking for the intervention of the native sixth tribulation powerhouses. In the end, the old man chose a place in a vast ocean to transcend. Compared to the land, which was practically filled with living beings, the surface of the vast ocean seemed much more barren. If he chose the ocean, the possibility of other sixth tribulation powerhouses intervening would be much lower. Of course, the preparation for transcendence wasn't just about choosing a location. It was also necessary to carry out some corresponding modifications to the environment. For example, setting up a formation, suppressing the laws, removing the shackles of the world, and so on. If he really had to explain it in detail, it would be impossible to explain it clearly. However, this old man was a sixth tribulation powerhouse after all, so these preparations were extremely easy for him. Half a month's time was obviously more than enough. On this day, where he stood, the world was filled with formless runes. They formed an indescribably exquisite formation that produced all sorts of indescribable power. The spacetime in this area was also very different from the spacetime in the outside world. It felt like it had been distorted and modified by some power. As for the changes in the layer of laws, there was even less to say. That was practically the most important part of all the preparations. Standing in the center of this area, the old man closed his eyes and carefully adjusted his state. His preparations could be said to be perfect. Under normal circumstances, transcending this world would definitely not be a problem. However, he also knew in his heart that this world was not his only opponent. Behind the heaven and earth phantom, the creator of this heaven and earth phantom was his true enemy. Right now, he was only preparing to deal with the shackles of the world, but he had no way of dealing with the creator behind this world. Under such circumstances, if the creator of the heaven and earth illusionary figure were to act, he could only adapt to the situation. Under such circumstances, how could he relax? Naturally, he had to adjust his state to his peak to deal with any possible opponents that might appear. After adjusting his state to its peak, the old man started to activate the formation he had set up. The power in his body started to slowly surge, and wisps of light that seemed to be alive seeped out of his body. They formed a subtle communication with the surrounding formation, the spacetime in this area, the layer of laws in the depths of spacetime, and even the great Tao. Amidst this communication, the ocean seemed to be boiling and began to tremble violently. In the sky, countless lightning flashed and thunder rumbled, and the entire area gradually became darker and darker. A feeling of an impending storm involuntarily arose. At this moment, numerous gazes were cast over from all directions. These gazes contained a sense of probing. Among them, the old man even felt that one of the gazes was extremely familiar. It was the gaze of the sixth tribulation powerhouse that he had visited once. "Everyone, do you want to stop me?" Suddenly, The old man frowned when he sensed the indescribable feeling in the gazes. The owners of those gazes were clearly sixth tribulation powerhouses, the strongest group of people in this world. At this moment, their gazes did not seem like they were looking at someone who was about to transcend and leave this world, but more like they were looking at a failure. It was as if they had already determined that he would not succeed no matter what. Although he knew that the creator of this world might use some means to prevent him from truly escaping, at least according to his arrangements, it should not be a problem for him to transcend this world. Under such circumstances, it was very doubtful what the gazes of these powerhouses meant. Not at all, not at all. We are only here to observe the ceremony. I hope that fellow Taoist can successfully transcend. At this moment, the sixth tribulation powerhouse that the old man had visited sent a voice transmission. Hearing this, the old man only frowned slightly. He knew that if they did not stop him, it would mean that his transcendence would really encounter a big problem. This problem might be so big that those powerhouses did not feel that he had any chance of success at all. However, it was like an arrow on a bowstring that had to be released. He could not possibly retreat just because of a few gazes from other powerhouses, right? He immediately said, "Since that's the case, I hope that everyone will not disturb me." As he spoke, he continued to stir the power in his body, triggering the light that he emitted. At this time, his body began to gradually intertwine with the surrounding space-time, with the surrounding rules and laws, and even the unseen Great Tao. As he moved, the surrounding space-time, the surrounding laws, and even the mysterious Great Tao all reacted. As the world underwent intense changes, it was as if the entire world was gradually shrinking towards him. An indescribable pressure began to gather towards him, and began to act on his body, forcing his body to shrink inwards. The operation of the formation gradually reached its peak, and the changes in spacetime also gradually reached its peak. Everything was going according to the old man's original plan. Things had progressed to this stage, but it still looked so perfect, as if nothing unexpected had happened. It's about to succeed. This thought flashed through the old man's mind. With this thought, he followed his original plan and instantly unleashed the terrifying power in his body that could crush the heavens and the earth. Following the trajectory of the light he released, it instantly spread to the surrounding area covered by the formation. It went deep into the law layer, and even affected the Great Tao in the dark. As this happened, the changes in his surroundings instantly became intense. His body seemed to have suddenly turned into an illusory shadow and began to become more and more blurry. Not long after, as the surrounding spacetime collapsed and the laws were damaged, his body completely disappeared from this world. However, even at this moment, none of the surrounding gazes disappeared. It was as if they clearly knew that things were not over even at this point. Indeed, in the next moment, the old man appeared in the spacetime that had just recovered with great excitement. It was as if he had completed an unimaginable feat. However, very soon, he sensed the spying gazes from the surroundings and sensed the familiar feeling from those gazes. He also sensed the many traces of power that he had left in the surroundings, and his expression became extremely ugly for a moment. How is this possible? I clearly transcended. How did I suddenly return? This was the thought that appeared in his mind at this moment. Chapter 3049. From the looks of it, the old man had spent a lot of effort and made a lot of preparations before finally returning to this world after transcending. Judging from his attitude, he didn't even know how the process had happened or what had changed during it. As expected, many sixth tribulation powerhouses sighed one by one, and the peeping gazes began to gradually disperse. Not long after, hundreds and thousands of peeping gazes had disappeared without a trace. Clearly, these sixth tribulation powerhouses were only interested in whether the old man's transcendence this time would be different from what they had expected. Even if they had already predicted that this would be the result. In fact, it could even be said that they themselves had done such a thing before. Otherwise, they would not have resisted like this, and the outcome would definitely be like this. Transcending a world was almost an instinct for existences that had the ability to transcend the world. These sixth tribulation powerhouses were naturally no exception. As sixth tribulation powerhouses, there weren't many benefits for them to cultivate in their own world. It could even be said that ever since they were close to reaching the tribulation stage, there was not much benefit to cultivating in this world. From then on, this world had only shackled them and restricted them. It was no longer the guidance, nurturing, or help they had received in the past. When the world became one's shackles and restrictions, then the cultivator would naturally want to transcend the world and leave it. Even if this world was their hometown, where they were born and grew up, it was still the same. These sixth tribulation powerhouses still remained in this world. It was clearly not their own will, but they had no choice. They were obviously trapped in this world as well, and they were unable to break free from it. No wonder you didn't care about publicizing the method of transcendence. You all want the latecomers to pave a path for you, right? After a while, the sage-like sixth tribulation powerhouse finally calmed down, and all the conveniences he had encountered were explained. It was no wonder that it was easier for him to gather information than he had imagined. It was no wonder that even if he left behind some traces that couldn't be hidden, those sixth tribulation experts still treated him as if he didn't exist. It was only when he began to take action and prepare to transcend this world that the sixth tribulation experts focused their gazes on him as if it was the first time they knew of his existence. All of this was clearly because the sixth tribulation experts were actually hoping that there would be an expert who could pave a path for them and do what they couldn't, so that they could gain enlightenment from it. Obviously, they were completely disappointed at this moment. What should I do next? The old man was at a loss. If he couldn't transcend this world, then everything would be for naught. If he couldn't even break free from one of the many shadows that were embedded in that heaven and earth shadow, how could he break free from the control of the creator of that heaven and earth shadow? No, I can't give in like this. If I give in like this, then I'll truly become his pawn. The old man shook his head and finally gathered his fighting spirit. After all, he was an existence that could cultivate to the sixth tribulation level from nothing. How could such an existence really give in so easily? Even those sixth tribulation experts who were born and raised in this world, although they seemed to have completely surrendered, weren't they actively spreading the method of transcendence to guide more people to transcend and pave a path for them? As a foreign sixth tribulation expert, the old man's heart naturally belonged to the outside world, and he belonged to freedom. Under such circumstances, his fighting spirit would only be stronger than that of a native sixth tribulation expert. Naturally, he wouldn't give up so easily. Since they already know that I'm here, then I don't need to hide anymore. With that thought, he decided what he should do next. Immediately, he casually waved his hand, and all the preparations he had made in the surroundings were directly erased. In the blink of an eye, the sea returned to its normal state, as if no cultivators had used any methods here. Following such a change, many pairs of eyes began to converge on him again. They were gazes that the old man was familiar with. They were the gazes of the sixth tribulation experts that were born and raised in this world. Clearly, the old man's choice made them curious about what exactly he wanted to do. They wanted to know exactly what new ideas he had. Clearly, the old man's guess about them was correct. As expected, they were waiting for the other experts to find a new way out. So, even though they knew that the old man's origins were very suspicious, they did not care about his origins. Instead, they were extremely eager to see what he could do. At this moment, the old man already knew what they were thinking, but he no longer cared about what secrets he might reveal by using the technique he displayed. After erasing all the preparations he had made, he let out a soft cry. Rays of light that seemed to come to life rushed out of his body. In an instant, they formed a vast and boundless world around him. This world was so real that it vaguely surpassed the illusion of the surrounding heaven and earth. However, the moment it appeared, the world's illusory figure naturally reacted in an indescribable way. Under this stress reaction, an illusory quality constantly permeated this world, gradually turning the surrounding world into an existence of the same nature as the surrounding heaven and earth. The reality that this world possessed that was higher than the world of this world began to be quickly erased. This world was actually a world similar to Luo Fan's world of laws. However, the path that the old man took was a righteous path. He did not first establish his worldview and then continuously perfect it. In the end, he slowly raised his worldview to the level of perfect heaven and earth and finally pushed his cultivation realm to the true divine stage. This kind of righteous path was the cultivation of concepts one by one, and the cultivation of concepts one by one. In the end, after countless concepts were gathered, only then would a perfect world view be formed. Under such circumstances, although the old man was a sixth tribulation expert, he still did not have a complete world view that belonged to him. What he had was a collection of countless concepts that belonged to him. From the perspective of a worldview, there were obviously too many omissions, too many gaps, and too many deficiencies in the collection of these concepts. However, if one looked at it purely from the perspective of a worldview, each of these concepts was extremely perfect. In fact, they could even be regarded as existences that were close to the level of a true sage's concept. It was obviously impossible to describe a world with such a collection of concepts. However, such a collection of concepts could clearly already be regarded as a world. A world was the sublimation of a world. Even an ordinary world was of a much higher level than a vast thousand world, and it was also much more perfect. On the other hand, a perfect world view surpassed an ordinary world view. It had already reached the level of a true sage that could exist in a state of chaos for a long time. An ordinary world view, even if it was extremely imperfect, could already describe all aspects of a world as long as it was a barely complete world view. In that case, the place that was constructed according to such a world view would be a world. Once this worldview was perfected countless times and finally advanced to the level of a perfect worldview, then because one's degree of completeness, degree of perfection, and degree of perfection had all reached a certain extreme, the world that was described would naturally be a perfect world. And this was also the ultimate pursuit of almost all cultivators. This was also the cultivation path taken by cultivators like Luo Fan who walked the opposite path. The difference was that if one did not have a complete worldview, even if one had countless concepts that had reached an extremely high level, it would still be impossible to perfectly describe a world no matter how simple and crude it was. In other words, no matter how simple and crude it was, there would definitely be some aspects that these concepts did not cover. Under such circumstances, the place that was created with the help of such a collection of concepts was obviously not even a world. It was only an existence at the level of a world. Even if it was extremely perfect and outstanding in some aspects, or even far stronger than an ordinary world in terms of level, it was still a world after all. Its imperfect characteristics meant that it was impossible for it to become even the crudest and most simple world. This was also the cultivation path taken by cultivators who walked the righteous path. It was also the cultivation path taken by the sage-like old man who had the appearance of a sixth tribulation powerhouse. At this moment, the world that appeared around the old man's body was created by the gathering of the many concepts that he had sorted out. It was a world that completely matched the concepts that he had sorted out in many aspects. In terms of the aspects that this world touched, its level was only one level lower than that of a perfect world. It could be said that if the aspects that this world lacked compared to a heaven and earth were completed, the heaven and earth that it transformed into would also become an almost perfect world. There might even be a chance for it to transform into a truly perfect world. Of course, this was just like how one could become a true sage after going through the 9 great tribulations by going against the heavenly way, and how one could become a true sage after going through the 9 great tribulations by going against the heavenly way. It sounded simple, but it was a terrifying project that could make an ordinary person despair. Normally speaking, only a cultivator who took the righteous path could achieve this step after walking through the 9 levels of the Tao Master's path and completing some kind of sublimation that no one knew about. At this moment, the world that appeared around the old man's body was a world formed by the many concepts that he had sorted out. The level of such a world was actually extremely high. Obviously, it was already an absolute colossal world. Moreover, it was a colossal world that was tens of thousands of times stronger than an ordinary colossal world. Although it was not a world, in fact, its power was not much worse than an ordinary world. At least, if Luo Fan was still a 6th tribulation powerhouse, the nomological world that he built would not be able to form an absolute crushing effect on this world. Of course, there would be an advantage, and it was not a small one. But after all, it was just an advantage. This is a world? He actually can't open up a world. How on earth did he cultivate to this level? At this time, the owners of those peeping eyes were all shocked. According to the old man's investigation, these 6th tribulation powerhouses were born and bred in this world, and he could even clearly find all kinds of traces left behind in every step of their cultivation process. However, in fact, the existence of these 6th tribulation powerhouses was born because of the imprint left in the nomological world by the world's creator, who was born in the state of chaos when Luo Fan was undergoing the 7th tribulation. In Luo Fan's tribulation, all the world's creators were obviously existences who took the path of the reverse. Their cultivation route was naturally not the kind that first opened up a world, then constantly perfected it, and finally, when the world turned into a world, it would directly sublimate to the extreme, turning the world directly into a perfect world. Instead, their cultivation route was based on Luo Fan's cultivation route. They first sorted out their own worldview, opened up a rough and simple world, and then continuously sublimated their own worldview, perfected their own worldview, and finally sublimated the world that they could open up, perfected the world that they could open up, and finally pushed the world to the level of a perfect world. Relying on this cultivation route, their cultivation realm would be pushed to the level of a true sage. Therefore, in the outside world, those who took the path of the reverse were the minority. However, in this world's virtual world, those who took the path of the reverse were the majority. On the contrary, those who took the path of the right were the minority among the minority, and the non-mainstream among the non-mainstream. It was precisely because of this that the 6th tribulation powerhouses were so shocked when they saw that the old man did not actually have a world around him, but a world. After all, no matter how powerful a world was, it was still a world after all. Chapter 30-50. At this moment, the old man naturally did not care whether the masters of the surrounding gazes were shocked by his actions or not. At this moment, he used the many concepts that he had sorted out over countless years to construct a powerful world. He did not do this to show off to those spying powerhouses that his path was different from theirs. His goal was to completely destroy this illusory world in front of him. No matter what, this world was not a great world, and it was not even a perfect world, although it was much stronger than this world in terms of overall form. However, in terms of strength in many aspects, it was only slightly stronger than this world. With the old man's world, it was naturally a fool's dream to completely destroy such a world. If he wanted to concentrate all his strength to create a hole in this world, the old man had absolute confidence. At this moment, this was exactly what he planned to do. According to this world's transcendence method, according to the transcendence method that he knew, he would not be able to transcend before he destroyed this illusory world. In that case, He naturally did not need to care whether this illusory world was intact or not without any scruples. It was obviously the best and most convenient choice to open up a hole in this part of the world and then rush out of this hole. If it was an ordinary powerhouse, even if they knew this method existed, they would not be able to do this. However, it was clear that this old man, who was at the peak of the sixth tribulation powerhouse, had the ability to do this. At this moment, he stirred up the world that he had constructed around his body, and the world's power began to circulate and brew along the world's structure under his will. As this circulation and brewing progressed, his world gradually began to shine. The originally corrosive effect of the illusory world on this world also slowed down during this process. It was as if the light that this world emitted was extremely effective against this corrosive effect. As the light became brighter and brighter, the world gradually seemed to have turned into an incomparably huge gem, faintly revealing a hint of crystalline charm. At this moment, the space-time around the world began to change. The world became dark, and the seawater turned into an extremely strange state in the blink of an eye. It was like water vapor, but also like fog. It also vaguely had the characteristics of a liquid state, as well as the characteristics of a solid state. This vast area did not only include the oceanic region. Apart from the ocean, large tracts of land were also affected. Compared to the seawater in the ocean, which changed from its original fluid state to that strange state, the matter on the land was obviously more complicated. Moreover, there were all kinds of creatures that the ocean didn't have. Although there were many living creatures in the ocean, there was even more seawater, and the living creatures were all hidden in the depths of the ocean. Compared to the seawater, the changes of living beings were more complicated, but they were all hidden in the changes of the seawater. Naturally, they were not obvious and were extremely difficult to detect. In contrast, the situation on land was different. On land, the ratio of living beings to the earth was much larger than the ratio of living beings to seawater in the ocean. Moreover, compared to the creatures in the ocean that were hidden in the depths of the sea, the creatures on the land were directly exposed. In this way, when they changed their forms in the land, they were naturally extremely conspicuous. Compared to the various lifeless things on land that transformed into the strange state of seawater, the transformation of the living creatures was extremely strange. It seemed to have transformed from a form of life that ordinary cultivators could understand into a strange form that was difficult to describe with words. Moreover, after the transformation, those living creatures directly integrated into the strange land around them. Although they could clearly feel their existence, it was difficult for them to truly see their existence. The range of this transformation was extremely wide, and in the end it even enveloped most of the sky. Just this transformation alone had turned countless living creatures into a completely different form. It could be said that they had completely lost their lives. Normally speaking, as the sixth tribulation experts who had the responsibility of protecting the world, they should have felt deep hatred towards the source of all these changes, the sage-like sixth tribulation expert. According to their normal behavior, what they should do at this moment was obviously to directly stop the old man. Only by stopping the old man would it be possible to eliminate all of these changes, and only then would it be possible for this world to return to its normal state. Allow all living beings to return. However, it was obvious that since it was normal, this was naturally an abnormal situation. At this moment, the hundreds and thousands of sixth tribulation powerhouses did not care about what the old man did. At this moment, they only quietly watched everything in front of them. They watched as the old man continuously stimulated the power of his world and stimulated the world more and more. Even the legendary sixth tribulation powerhouse, who was said to be the embodiment of all beauty and could even be treated as an equal by ordinary people, was not moved by the terrifying changes that affected most of the world. It was as if everything in front of them was just an illusion, an insignificant illusion. Evidently, The appearance that seemed to be the embodiment of all beauty was just an appearance. Her heart was no different from other sixth tribulation powerhouses. To her, as long as she could pave a path of transcendence, even if the world was destroyed, it would definitely be worth it. This mentality was clearly the common mentality of all sixth tribulation powerhouses. At this moment, it was clearly because of this mentality that the sixth tribulation powerhouses turned a blind eye to the old man's actions. They only quietly waited for the results of his actions. With this convenience, the old man's plan was carried out extremely smoothly. At this moment, the world around him gradually began to tremble indescribably. As it trembled, the void was gradually torn apart. The law layer was instantly torn apart, and time was completely severed. Under this change, this area gradually disappeared from the senses of all living beings. It felt as if it was gradually breaking away from the illusory image of this world. Can he succeed? A sixth tribulation powerhouse seemed to be muttering to himself, but also seemed to be asking others. The possibility isn't high, another sixth tribulation powerhouse said. Indeed. Although his methods are a bit strange, the method itself isn't too special. We couldn't succeed in the past, so he probably won't succeed now. Another sixth tribulation powerhouse sighed. There was a hint of regret in his words. Perhaps it will be a little different. His methods are too strange after all. A sixth tribulation powerhouse still held onto the last bit of hope in his heart. Although the sixth tribulation powerhouses were chatting with each other, they didn't stop paying attention to the old man. After all, no matter how impossible it was, they still held on to a bit of hope and hoped for a miracle to happen. At this moment, the world around the old man seemed to have turned into the gathering of countless sharp blades. The power it released had already completely affected the surrounding world. Earth-shattering sounds constantly reverberated inside and outside the world. Ripples visible to the naked eye continuously spread out in all directions. Under the influence of these ripples, the world that had changed over half of its shape underwent all sorts of indescribable changes. Vaguely, there was an incredible rebound effect constantly being transmitted back from the surroundings and blasted into the world. Kacha, 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 kacha. Countless densely packed cracks continuously appeared on the crystal-clear gem, adding more and more flaws to the gem. The old man had already expected such a change. If he wanted to break this world, then this world would naturally produce a rebound force that would similarly destroy the bridgehead of this world. However, it was clear that the destruction of this world was nothing to him. The purpose of this world's appearance was only to break this world so that he could leave this world. As long as he could achieve this goal, it didn't matter even if this world completely collapsed and was completely destroyed. In this way, he naturally didn't need to care about any damage to the world around him at all. After all, although there were countless cracks, that world still existed. It still retained the basic functions that he had used to construct this world in the first place. Since that was the case, he naturally wouldn't care about what happened to this world. At this moment, not only did he not retract his power, but he even further stimulated the potential of the world, causing the collision between the world and the world to become even more intense. A sound that sounded like a bell, a drum, a gong, a swona, a zither, and so on and so forth suddenly spread throughout the world. With this sound, the world around the old man directly collapsed and turned into countless fragments of the world. Under the effect of the world's surrounding world, it completely disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. At this moment, the old man's body had already disappeared from this world's illusory world. He succeeded? At this moment, many sixth tribulation powerhouses were inexplicably shocked. From this, it was clear that the old man had already left this world. What did this mean? It meant that this method of violently breaking the world's illusory world was actually correct, and it was possible to transcend. They hadn't been able to do this before, But that was only because they had done it wrong in the past. For a moment, many sixth tribulation powerhouses were restless. They couldn't wait to immediately repeat the old man's previous actions, transcend, and leave this world's illusory world. Just when they almost couldn't help but take action, the laws of this world instantly underwent some indescribable change. It was as if a card had become another card in the blink of an eye. An indescribable feeling of awkwardness instantly appeared in the hearts of many sixth tribulation powerhouses. What's going on? They were all bewildered. In this instant, most of the world's strange shape disappeared without a trace. This originally changed region only took the blink of an eye to return to its normal state. The world was clear again, and living beings and all things were clearly separated once more. As for the ocean, needless to say, it had once again turned into a vast and boundless ocean. Of course, even so, the newly formed world, ocean, and all things and living beings were completely different from before. Whether it was all things or living beings, whether it was the world or the ocean, they all looked completely different from before. It felt as if he had truly changed to another world, if it wasn't for the fact that this change was only limited to the world that had previously become extremely strange, and that everything outside seemed no different from before. The sixth tribulation powerhouses would have suspected that they had really been transferred to another world without realizing it. An inexplicable sense of foreboding appeared in the hearts of many sixth tribulation powerhouses. They could vaguely guess what was going to happen next. And just as they had expected, after the world changed, the sage-like figure of the sixth tribulation powerhouse appeared out of thin air at his original position. It looked as if he had just turned invisible, and his body hadn't left that position at all. Facing the completely different space-time, completely different laws, completely different geographical environment, and completely different living beings, the first thought that came to the old man's mind was that he had finally left that world and truly transcended. Clang. Soon, this thought completely disappeared. His expression instantly became unprecedentedly unsightly. He suddenly let out a furious roar. How could this be? How could this happen? I've already broken the world. I've definitely broken the world completely. Why did I still come back? At this time, the surrounding peeping gazes didn't disperse. Instead, they were still paying attention to the sage-like old man, as if they were still hoping that something different would appear on him. As for why the old man realized that this wasn't a new world, but the original world, the reason was naturally because he felt the familiar peeping gazes around him. Chapter 3052. Compared to the world of law's projection, on the other side, in the layer of nothingness with the most cultivators, on the island formed by the 365 worlds constructed by Luo Fan, the middle-aged woman who looked like a seventh tribulation powerhouse had already reached an extremely critical juncture. The amount of time she had spent in the second layer and the number of reincarnations she had gone through had reached a certain limit. Before this limit, she still had a chance to turn back and find herself again. But if she exceeded this limit, she would forever be trapped and unable to reincarnate. Even if Luo Fan directly grabbed her the moment she exceeded the limit and gave her everything that was originally imprisoned, she would no longer be the original her. Herself, her thoughts, and everything else would no longer be the same. At that time, it would be equivalent to the seventh tribulation expert completely losing her incarnation. In fact, it was even more troublesome than losing her incarnation. After all, losing her incarnation was only losing her incarnation. If she really exceeded this limit, not only would she lose her incarnation, but she would also gain an enemy that knew her incomparably well. Ordinary incarnations that obtained independence might not have much hostility towards the main body, and there was a chance that they wouldn't become enemies. However, if the middle-aged woman's incarnation exceeded that limit, then there was clearly no possibility that they would become enemies. After all, compared to ordinary incarnations, the middle-aged woman's incarnation had already reincarnated in the second layer too many times. After so many reincarnations, the protective consciousness had long been completely separated from the original consciousness, making it impossible for the two to coexist. Therefore, once such an outcome occurred, the incarnation and the main body would be completely irreconcilable. They would become true enemies, and there would no longer be any possibility of reconciliation. Moreover, once the incarnation obtained independence, it might even be accepted by the Tao Master's prison, allowing the Tao Master's prison to recognize it as qualified to cultivate in the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path without any restrictions. After all, compared to ordinary incarnations that obtain freedom, if the middle-aged woman's incarnation obtained freedom in this way, then the degree of freedom would be unimaginable. Perhaps the Tao Master's path would completely treat her as a brand new life form, a brand new cultivator. Naturally, the restrictions of the seventh tribulation expert would not appear on her. Of course, there was another possibility, and that was that once the incarnation became independent, it would be directly transferred to the first layer of the Tao Master's path. After all, if it was a brand new life form, there would be no record of it in the Tao Master's path. In other words, for the Tao Master's path, it was obvious that she had not stepped into any layer of the Tao Master's path. Where would a cultivator who had not stepped into any level of the Tao Master path appear after stepping into the Tao Master path? Obviously, he would only appear in the first level of the Tao Master path. As for what the specific situation was, it could only be determined after the incident had taken place. As for the specific situation, it could obviously only be determined after it happened. After all, the final arrangement of the Tao Master's path depended on the mechanism of the Tao Master's path. Apart from the true saint who had built the Tao Master's path, who could really determine how things would develop before the results appeared. At this time, Luo Fan shifted his attention from his many clones to the clones around the island. The reason for this was that he believed that the seventh tribulation expert's body would definitely take action. She would never sit back and watch her incarnation become independent and eventually become his enemy. Obviously, the seventh tribulation expert's body, as the incarnation's body, was obviously more aware of the irreversible boundary of the incarnation than Luo Fan. Therefore, at this time, the seventh tribulation expert's body would inevitably react. Luo Fan floated outside the island and waited quietly, waiting for the inevitable upheaval. As time continued to move closer to the boundary, an inexplicable subtle feeling began to gradually emerge from the bottom of Luo Fan's heart. This feeling was so subtle, as if some kind of behemoth was constantly approaching him. It also seemed that some kind of indescribable danger was gradually surging towards him. In the face of such a change, a faint smile gradually appeared on Luo Fan's face. Although he still did not know what form the next change would take, at least, for now, his judgment was correct. The seventh tribulation expert, who looked like a middle-aged woman, was gradually approaching. At a certain moment, when the boundary was finally reached, a strange light emerged from the void. A bizarre brilliance appeared from nothingness. In a flash, it had already penetrated into the island that Luo Fan had constructed, which had 365 layers of worlds. The light penetrated the first world and went straight into the second world, where it instantly fused with the middle-aged woman's clone in that world. As the two fused, the incarnation that had already reincarnated countless times suddenly froze on the spot. The incarnation was originally in an extremely dangerous situation. The boundary naturally did not appear out of thin air. In fact, the appearance of the boundary could only be caused by the incarnation's reincarnation as a node. In other words, the arrival of the boundary represented the end of the incarnation of this seventh tribulation powerhouse's incarnation in this life. At this moment, as the light fused with the incarnation's body, the incarnation's power began to rise. In the blink of an eye, it had already broken through the incarnation's original shackles. A huge and unparalleled aura erupted from its body and completely enveloped the surrounding thousands of miles. This included the Incarnation's original enemy. The Incarnation's original strength was only that of an ordinary creature with a bit of extraordinary power. The enemies that such an existence might encounter were naturally existences on the same level as it. There was no need to say what would happen to such an existence when the Incarnation's strength increased by thousands of times. Just the aura released by the Incarnation was enough to completely suppress the enemy in front of it. Then, as the Incarnation unconsciously erupted with power, the enemy's entire body was completely crushed before it even had the chance to resist. At this moment, Luo Fan said indifferently, "You've lost." As he spoke, the 365 worlds erupted with unimaginable power at the same time. In the blink of an eye, the invisible power gathered in the second world and instantly enveloped the area 10,000 miles around the Incarnation of the middle-aged woman. In an instant, time and space stagnated. The rules and laws seemed to have turned into solidified amber and were completely frozen on the spot. All the effects that the Incarnation had caused were instantly suppressed. All the changes stopped in the blink of an eye. "Fellow Taoist, why are you so aggressive?" At this moment, an inexplicable sigh came from the Incarnation's mouth. Although almost everything about the Incarnation had been completely suppressed, it obviously had a different source of power. However, this Incarnation obviously had a different source of power. Even if she was suppressed like this, she still had the ability to talk to Luo Fan. This method is actually very ingenious. Before you used it, I never thought that there would be such a method, Luo Fan said with a smile at this time. At this time, it was obviously not the Incarnation of the Seven Tribulations expert who was talking to him, but the real body of the Seven Tribulations expert. As for the method he used, it was none other than his real body that bypassed the limitations of the Tao Master's path and directly manipulated the Incarnation through some extremely mysterious means. With the help of the similarities between the real body and the Incarnation and the subtle resonance between them, he bypassed the limitations of the Tao Master's path and directly manipulated the Incarnation. In other words, although it seemed that the Incarnation was speaking at this time, in fact, every syllable of the Incarnation was under the control of the real body. All the actions of the Incarnation and all the information it received did not come from the Incarnation itself, but from the real body of the middle-aged woman behind the Incarnation. As soon as this situation appeared, Luo Fan already knew the middle-aged woman's choice. Obviously, the middle-aged woman did not intend to save the Incarnation. Instead, she intended to completely erase the Incarnation before it became completely independent. After all, her current behavior was equivalent to completely destroying the independence of the Incarnation itself. It could be said that she had completely treated the Incarnation as a puppet. In this case, once the support of the middle-aged woman's real body was taken away, the Incarnation could only end up completely collapsing. Since she had already done this, the intention of the middle-aged woman, who looked like a Seven Tribulations expert, was obviously self-evident. Naturally, the only possibility was to completely give up the Incarnation. But this was actually a matter of course. After all, the difficulty of destroying the Incarnation was obviously completely different from rescuing it from this island. To destroy the Incarnation, she only needed to rely on the subtle resonance between the real body and the Incarnation to easily do this. At the very least, before the Incarnation became completely independent, she only needed to do this to achieve this goal easily. However, if she wanted to rescue the Incarnation from that island and completely free it from Luo Fan's means, it was obviously not that simple. It was equivalent to directly facing an enemy that was stronger than herself. There was no need to talk about whether it was possible. Even if it was possible, the difficulty would be unimaginably high. In contrast, the difficulty of destroying the Incarnation was secondary. More importantly, even if the Incarnation was lost, it would only be a loss of some power for the middle-aged woman. If her essence hadn't been seized by Luo Fan, she would still have to worry about her various secrets being leaked along with the loss of the incarnation. However, it was obvious that the middle-aged woman did not need to worry about this at all, therefore, it was obviously very normal for her to make such a choice. The middle-aged woman was obviously not interested in explaining to Luo Fan the method she used to talk to Luo Fan at this moment. At this moment, she only controlled her incarnation and said, "I can feel that you have done something terrible to my essence. No, no, no. That's the only point. You have misunderstood me. It's not that I have done anything to your essence, but that something has happened to your essence." At this moment, Luo Fan did not dwell on the means that the other party had used, and he only followed along with the other party's topic. The woman frowned. She naturally did not want to believe what Luo Fan said, but it was obvious that she could not imagine that Luo Fan still had a need to lie to her at this moment. After all, the matter could not be more obvious. At this moment, it was already impossible for her to turn the tables. No matter what her attitude and thoughts towards Luo Fan was, it could not change the fact that was already destined. In this case, there was obviously no need for her to lie. "What do you mean?" she finally could not help but ask. "If you are interested, I can bring you there to take a look." Luo Fan smiled faintly at this moment. He did not mention anything about the bet. Although the middle-aged woman's true body had directly controlled the incarnation, it actually meant that she had completely lost this bet. Although the incarnation still existed on the surface, it had essentially changed from an incarnation to a puppet. Since it was a puppet, it naturally could not continue the previous bet. Of course, it was equivalent to giving up on the bet and being considered a complete failure. However, to the current him, the wager behind the wager no longer held much meaning to him. Currently, what he was more concerned about was the research on the related functions of the Great Tao and the rules, as well as the source of the abnormal will produced by the essence. Compared to these two, the various secrets that belonged to the seventh tribulation powerhouses that the essence represented had clearly become insignificant. As he spoke, he did not wait for the middle-aged woman's incarnation to react. With a thought, he directly controlled the supreme power that the island itself possessed. With a slight tremble, he brought the incarnation directly across the layers of worlds, from the second layer of the world to the 200th layer of the world, where the essence was at this moment. This island was different from the other worlds. The deeper one went, the more desolate and the less vitality there was. At the 200th layer of the world, it had already become a wilderness, and the world was filled with an indescribable sense of desolation. And the essence did not exist in a formless form at this moment. Instead, it had directly turned into a rather large mountain range. At first glance, this mountain range did not seem to have anything in common with the formless essence. However, the middle-aged woman's incarnation only needed to look at the mountain range to know that it was her essence. Chapter 3053. The moment she saw this essence, the middle-aged woman knew that her essence had changed in a way that she did not want to see. The source of this feeling was none other than the fact that she could only rely on her familiarity with the essence to confirm that this mountain range was formed from her essence. Apart from that, there was no other connection between her and this essence. Such a situation would never have happened if she was in her normal state. "What did you do to my essence?" At this moment, the middle-aged woman immediately pointed to Luo Fan, the master of the 365 levels of the world. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "What did I do? No, 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 I didn't do anything. Everything that has happened to you is a result of the change in your nature." As he spoke, Luo Fan pointed at the mountain range ahead. A space portal appeared in front of them out of thin air. Through this space portal, one could see a vast and boundless universe. In the starry sky of the universe, there were countless stars. This was the scene inside the essence. Although they were stars, the middle-aged woman could sense that every single one of them was very familiar. It was as if they were a part of her, just that they were presented in a different form. It has its own will. Then, as the source of this essence, she immediately discovered the abnormality of this essence. After discovering this, she felt that her worldview was almost overturned. This was her essence, which was an invisible and intangible existence. Normally speaking, it was already incredible for it to transform into this specific form, but it actually gave birth to a will similar to the will of heaven and earth. This was simply challenging all the knowledge that she had accumulated in the past hundreds of millions of years. At this time, Luo Fan only smiled faintly at the middle-aged woman's incarnation, but he did not respond to her exclamation. Now, he was more interested in the interaction between the abnormal will of the essence and the middle-aged woman. One was the master of the essence, while the other was a brand new abnormal will born from the essence. He was extremely curious about what would happen between the two. At this moment, the incarnation that belonged to Luo Fan in the essence flashed slightly and disappeared without a trace, directly fusing with the incarnation standing outside the space portal. All the means that he had used against the abnormal will disappeared completely at this moment, allowing the abnormal will to regain its freedom. At this moment, the abnormal will did not return to the residence of the abnormal will. Instead, it gathered its perception and probed the space portal. More specifically, it probed the middle-aged woman's incarnation outside the space portal. At this moment, the middle-aged woman's body emitted a powerful aura that fiercely collided with the abnormal will's perception. With this collision, the void collapsed, and the space portal that was originally not too big collapsed in an instant. However, the collapse of the space portal did not completely cut off the connection between the space-time inside the essence and the outside world. On the contrary, with the collapse of the spatial portal, the space-time inside and outside was completely connected. The connection that was originally limited to within the portal was directly expanded to more than 1,000 times its original size. The relationship between space-time and space was extremely mysterious. Space-time included time and space. In other words, a piece of space-time had its own independent space and independent time. Perhaps this kind of time and space were extremely similar to other times and spaces, and they even behaved almost the same. However, this did not change the fact that the time and space between different space-time were independent. Generally, it was not too complicated to establish a connection between space-time of the same nature. It could even be said that it was as easy as connecting two buildings together. However, this was only because the nature of the space-time was similar, which greatly simplified the entire communication process. It did not mean that the communication between space-time was that simple. In fact, if any two independent space-time wanted to communicate with each other, to establish a connection, to establish a spatial passage between them, and to establish a spatial connection, the subtle changes and complexity involved would definitely exceed the limits of the imagination of most living beings. First of all, one had to harmonize the space so that the originally independent space-time could harmonize and resonate with each other. Only then would the first step be completed. After that, one had to harmonize time. Even if the space-time harmonized and resonated with each other, if the time was still independent and had no connection with each other, it would only be equivalent to two parallel spacetimes. Obviously, if that was all, the two spacetimes were obviously not enough to establish a real connection. It was precisely because of this that harmonizing time was so important. Even if the spacetime harmonized, it was still not the last step to connect the two spacetimes. If it was only this step, the two spacetimes might be able to sense and see each other, but it would still be impossible for the matter and living beings in them to interact with each other. This was because different spacetimes had different rules and regulations. If these rules and regulations could naturally communicate with each other, it would naturally avoid the following troubles. However, it was obvious that the rules and regulations of different spacetimes could naturally communicate with each other. It was just a special situation. If it was a conversation that was universal, the rules and regulations of different spacetimes would obviously not be able to communicate with each other naturally. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that the rules and regulations of both spacetimes had to be adjusted to be able to allow the rules and regulations of both sides to communicate with each other. Apart from that, there were also countless troublesome differences that arose because of this. These differences needed to be addressed one by one in order to truly connect the two spacetimes together. However, although the process of connecting different spacetimes was like that, generally speaking, connecting spacetimes would not really change the spacetime completely. After all, it was only to connect spacetimes, and not to completely homogenize the two spacetimes. Generally speaking, connecting spacetimes was actually just to build a moderate area between the two spacetimes and become a bridge between the two spacetimes, allowing one to harmonize the time, space, rules, and everything else in the two spacetimes at the same time. The process of change was much more complicated than completely changing one side. In other words, in fact, the process of Luo Fan opening the spatial door to a certain space seemed to be casual, but it actually contained a huge amount of subtle changes. The reason why it seemed casual and relaxed was because Luo Fan's means were too brilliant, and his strength was too shocking. The method needed to connect different spacetimes clearly showed that the different nature of spacetimes did not have any intrinsic impact on this kind of communication. The entire process of communication was the same, but the greater the difference between the spacetimes, the greater the adjustment needed. In other words, even if the spacetime within the essence was illusory, or even void, it was just a metaphysical spacetime. However, if one wanted to connect that spacetime with this world, the process of communication was no different from the normal spacetime. Naturally, although there was no difference in essence, the difficulty was naturally completely different. If it was an ordinary cultivator, it would be almost impossible to connect such a spacetime with this world. The reason why this kind of communication seemed so smooth and easy at this time was only because the existence that established this kind of communication was extremely extraordinary. After all, what kind of existence could make the connection between the spacetime and this world expand to such an extent? One of them was a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Although she was only using her incarnation to display her power, a seventh tribulation powerhouse was still a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Even if she was using her incarnation to display her power, her means were definitely not what any sixth tribulation powerhouse could compare to. What was the other existence? The other party that truly established the connection between the spacetime and this world was the abnormal will that was equivalent to the will of the world. As an existence that was similar to the will of the world, its own level was almost equivalent to the level of the world it was in. What was the world? The world was the essence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. In this way, it could be considered as an existence that contained all the secrets of the seventh tribulation powerhouse and all the mysteries of cultivation. Its level was naturally equivalent to the level of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. Obviously, since the world was at such a level, the level of the abnormal will was also the same. It was also at the level of the seventh tribulation powerhouse. For existences of this level, it was already an almost instinctive behavior to connect different spacetimes, spacetime and the world, and even different worlds and different heavens and earth. As a result, they were able to expand the spatial door to this extent without even realizing it, allowing the world to truly connect with the world. At this time, the middle-aged woman manipulated her incarnation to directly face the abnormal will. Her eyes were like searchlights that directly penetrated the endless distance and saw the body of the abnormal will. At this time, the abnormal will also directly saw the incarnation of the middle-aged woman. Its perception seemed to penetrate everything, directly penetrating the barrier of the incarnation and seeing the existence behind the incarnation. It was the owner of the incarnation, the seventh tribulation powerhouse in the appearance of the middle-aged woman. Both of them could see themselves in each other. They could see themselves in another possibility. At this moment, an inexplicable hostility was born in both of their hearts at the same time. For the seventh tribulation powerhouse, the emergence of such an abnormal will in her essence meant that her essence had already betrayed her. It meant that there was an enemy who was extremely familiar with her on the road to becoming a Tao master, but who might have a strong hostility towards her. For the abnormal will, the existence of the seventh tribulation powerhouse was equivalent to an enemy who originally controlled everything about her and would never be willing to let her leave and regain her freedom. Facing each other like this, it was obvious what kind of attitude they would have. "Let me see what it is that made you appear," said the seventh tribulation powerhouse in the appearance of the middle-aged woman. Suddenly, there was a flash of light and shadow on her body, turning into countless silk threads that gushed out wildly. They made a turn in the void and directly inserted into the space connection between the metaphysical spacetime inside the essence and this world. They quickly poured into the spacetime inside the essence, and in the blink of an eye, they covered the entire spacetime, or rather, the entire universe, so that the entire universe seemed to be shrouded in a faint golden haze. After all, the seventh tribulation powerhouse was the owner of the essence, even if the essence had already given birth to its own abnormal will and completely cut off the connection between it and her. But her degree of familiarity with the essence was still far from what ordinary existences could compare with. At this time, she directly targeted the flaw in the essence and easily transmitted her power to the entire universe inside the essence, covering it completely in an instant. Of course, the birth of the abnormal will was obviously not within the scope of her knowledge. Therefore, the strange spacetime where the abnormal will's main body was located and the extremely special island that should have been the focus of her investigation was not shrouded by even more light fog. Although it was not that there was no light fog covering the spacetime and the abnormal will's main body, that was more of a side effect of the seventh tribulation powerhouse's familiarity with the essence and covering the entire universe with her power. In other words, because the abnormal will's main body and the spacetime belonged to this universe, it was covered by the light fog. In other words, the light fog was only treating it like a normal thing that existed in this universe. This kind of power was enough to completely study the void, but it was obviously a fool's dream to want to understand the essence of the abnormal will. Therefore, although the light fog had already covered the entire universe, the seventh tribulation powerhouse was still confused about the root cause of the abnormal will's birth. She couldn't even see through how the abnormal will controlled the entire universe. At this moment, the abnormal will clearly reacted. It didn't move at all, but in the blink of an eye, a vortex gradually began to appear in the boundary between the universe and the outside world, gradually covering the entire boundary. Chapter 3054. This vortex was obviously formed by the abnormal will. Its essence was similar to the vortex formed by the will of the world. The vortex looked like a huge eye, and the center of the vortex was the eyeball of the eye. At this moment, the middle-aged woman felt like she was being stared at by a huge eye. Along with this change, the middle-aged woman felt that her perception of the starry sky inside the vortex had started to weaken substantially. The middle-aged woman furrowed her brows slightly. The scene before her meant that the abnormal will's control over the starry sky inside the vortex was far beyond her imagination. That was the only way such a situation could occur. At this moment, although her perception of the starry sky inside the vortex had weakened substantially, it had not been completely cut off. Therefore, during this process, she could clearly feel that the golden mist covering the entire starry sky was being cut off at an extremely fast speed. In just a short while, the density of the mist covering the starry sky had decreased by more than half. This was still not the end. After that, her mist of light continued to weaken at an even faster rate. As the mist weakened, her perception of the starry sky became more and more blurry. Seeing this, the middle-aged woman naturally could not just sit back and do nothing. At this moment, her figure swayed and she directly crashed into the vortex. The vortex could be said to be the manifestation of the abnormal will. At this moment, when the middle-aged woman crashed into it, it was as if she had directly crashed into the body of the abnormal will. The degree of danger was self-evident. It could be said that at this moment, she had already opened up all her weaknesses to the abnormal will. At this moment, the vortex produced endless fluctuations, and an unknown amount of indescribable power was released from it, directly drowning the middle-aged woman. Facing such an attack, the middle-aged woman's expression did not change. Although these fluctuations and power were used on the parts that made her feel the most uncomfortable, they were produced in the most painful way. In that instant, he felt as if his body, his strength, his might, and everything else were under incredible pressure at this moment. However, she had already predicted all of this before she fell into this whirlpool. Therefore, she naturally wouldn't be moved by this at this moment. At this moment, she simply released her will and began to interact with the vortex around her in an indescribable way. Under that effect, the surrounding vortexes faintly produced some indescribable chaos. This chaos was rather weak, to the point that if one did not observe it carefully, they would completely ignore it. However, it was obvious that even such a weak chaos was extremely obvious to the abnormal willpower. After all, at this very moment, she was fighting against the original owner of this essence. If he dared not to be careful in the process of fighting, what kind of battle would he need to be careful in? As such, at this moment, the abnormal will instantly gathered its will towards the chaotic areas, using its powerful will to suppress the chaos. It wanted to sort out the chaos and turn it back into order so that it could regain absolute control over it. However, just like how the abnormal will knew the owner of this essence very well, Lin Yun was not a match for the owner of this essence. As the master of the essence, the middle-aged woman also had a deep understanding of the abnormal will that was born from the essence. At this moment, she had already considered what the abnormal will's focus was, what actions it would take in the future, and what choices it would make. Therefore, at this moment, the chaos was not only not wiped away by the abnormal will's will. On the contrary, it was like a living creature, constantly swimming in the vortex in an unimaginable way, continuously absorbing more of the vortex's main body and continuously growing. The entire process was like a small fish shuttling nimbly in the vortex, constantly devouring some kind of nutrients in the surroundings to grow. During this process, the abnormal will felt that there seemed to be some thoughts that did not belong to it in its heart. These thoughts were incomparably compatible with his own will, and were almost no different from his own naturally generated thoughts. In fact, compared to the thoughts that it usually produced, it seemed more like it was produced by its own will. On the contrary, its usual thoughts seemed to be some kind of additional external thoughts. These thoughts told it that it was not the real her now. Right now, it was just a consciousness in a dream, a self that was distorted by the illusion of a dream. She needed to wake up from her dream in order to obtain her true self and truly break free from the influence of the distorted illusion. These thoughts continued to grow as the chaos in the vortex continued to expand. She felt that it was just a small, faintly discernible distracting thought at first, but as time passed, this distracting thought gradually occupied her attention, gradually suppressing the other more and more thoughts, taking up more and more weight in her heart. Sensing such changes, the abnormal will naturally could not sit back and do nothing. At this moment, a clear light swept through the vortex. The chaotic area was instantly covered by the clear light and began to gradually separate from the chaotic vortex in the surroundings. After all, this was the vortex that the abnormal will had manifested. Naturally, she did not think of anyone else who had the ability to control this vortex. Therefore, soon, the chaotic area was completely separated from the other chaotic areas in the surroundings. As the chaos was separated by the clear light, the abnormal will felt that the thoughts that made it doubt whether its existence was real were also separated. Although those thoughts were still popping up in his mind, they were no longer able to disturb him. If it was understood in a way that ordinary people could understand, those thoughts before were like someone experiencing something in the real world. However, the current situation was that this person saw the development of something through watching a movie. Obviously, the influence of experiencing something in the real world was far greater than watching a movie. Therefore, at this moment, the influence of those thoughts on her almost completely disappeared. Of course, the middle-aged woman would not give up just like that. The current situation was not beyond her expectations. Before entering the vortex, she had already expected this, and had already made all sorts of preparations to deal with such a situation. It was precisely because of this that she rushed into this vortex without hesitation and faced the abnormal will's main body. At this moment, facing the chaotic clear light around her, layers of dimensions suddenly unfolded from the middle-aged woman's body. In the blink of an eye, the clear light began to split into countless attributes and was absorbed into those dimensions. Generally speaking, only seventh tribulation powerhouses had this kind of method of splitting dimensions. If it was a sixth tribulation powerhouse, facing such a method of splitting dimensions, they would definitely lose all ability to resist and be easily split into countless attributes. Obviously, this abnormal will was not a sixth tribulation powerhouse. Actually, she could be considered another middle-aged woman. Based on what the middle-aged woman felt, she could actually be considered another possibility of the middle-aged woman. Under such circumstances, as a seventh tribulation powerhouse, the middle-aged woman naturally also had the abnormal will. Although she was far from being as brilliant as Luo Fan in this kind of method of splitting dimensions, she could even use the power of many levels to split dimensions. However, it was not difficult for her to match up to the middle-aged woman. Therefore, at this moment, when the dimensions split the clear light into countless attributes and absorbed them into the countless dimensions, there were also many dimensions that appeared on the clear light. These dimensions intertwined with the dimensions released by the middle-aged woman and instantly cancelled out the effects of the dimensional splitting. Although the dimensional splitting was called dimensional splitting, it was actually far more than just splitting. If it was just division, then wouldn't the existence who used this method also suffer the same division and be divided into countless attributes and be absorbed into the countless dimensions? If that was the case, then what was the difference between splitting a complete battlefield and turning it into countless battlefields? Therefore, this dimensional splitting definitely had the magical effect of protecting one's body from being affected by the dimensional splitting. Only such a magical effect could allow this dimensional splitting to be used in battle. At this moment, the abnormal willpower was clearly using this method to protect itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting method. Of course, protecting itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting was not just to protect itself from being affected by the dimensional splitting. This kind of protection was definitely omnidirectional. No matter what form it took, any dimensional splitting that was cast by any existence would definitely be able to protect itself. If there were two completely unfamiliar existences, the dimensional splitting that was cast by two completely different people naturally would not be able to cancel out each other so easily and form a true balance between them. However, it was clear that the middle-aged woman and the abnormal will were not completely unfamiliar existences. Their familiarity with each other far exceeded the familiarity between any two people. After all, when they looked at each other, it was as if they were looking at another version of themselves. Therefore, they were able to easily grasp the number and strength of the dimensional splitting and achieve the ability to cancel out each other's dimensional splitting. Of course, no matter which party it was, they clearly did not want their dimensional splitting to only be able to cancel out the other party's dimensional splitting. Both of them were extremely eager to not only suppress the other party's dimensional splitting, but they also wanted to go a step further and divide the other party into countless attributes, and then completely eliminate the other party. Therefore, after canceling out each other's dimensional splitting, they did not stop there. Instead, they continued to push their dimensional splitting, wanting to overcome the other party's resistance and completely divide the other party. However, it was clear that both of them had similar thoughts. Therefore, at this moment, although their dimensional division technique would occasionally overlap, and there would be times when one side would suppress the other side would not be able to suppress the other side. But most of the time, they were in a state of balance, and neither could suppress the other. Of course, although they were in a state of balance, it did not mean that their battle was dull and monotonous. In fact, although they were in a state of balance in the end, it was precisely because of this balance that their dimensional splitting was so intense and exciting that it was indescribable. It could be said that during their battle, billions of strange and wonderful ideas appeared in their minds at every moment. Their attacks were like surging tides, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that they covered the sky and covered the earth. Just by looking at the number of dimensions they split up, one could see how intense their battle was in the process. It must be known that the dimensional splitting that they carried out at the beginning only covered hundreds of thousands of dimensions. But as time went by, and as they clashed again and again, the number of dimensions they had divided had already reached tens of billions of dimensions. Dividing tens of billions of dimensions had a great impact on the boundary between this world and the internal universe, and it had reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, the border area had already become extremely chaotic. If it were not for the manifestation vortex of the abnormal willpower that was still there, replacing the various special features of the boundary, perhaps the connection between the universe and this world would have been completely severed. If it really came to that, the battle between the two of them might be able to pause for a while. Of course, such an outcome was clearly unacceptable to both parties. The middle-aged woman was extremely repulsed by the abnormal willpower that was destined to be her enemy, and before she destroyed it, she would not let go no matter what. As for the abnormal willpower, how could she be willing to let go of an enemy that would never give up on dealing with her and was determined to destroy her? Even if they were to temporarily let go, it was absolutely unacceptable for both of them. Therefore, even though the abnormal willpower knew that it was it that maintained the communication between the two worlds and maintained the existence of this battlefield, it had no intention of letting go. Chapter 30:55. When the middle-aged woman and the abnormal will began to fight, Luo Fan had been watching from the side. Whether it was the middle-aged woman or the abnormal will, both of them were well aware of his existence. However, it was obvious that they did not have the ability and did not feel the need to care about Luo Fan. Needless to say, Luo Fan's strength had been vividly displayed when they fought against each other. Both the unusual consciousness and the middle-aged woman had suffered a great loss at his hands. They were only able to survive because of Luo Fan's will. Therefore, in terms of ability, it was obvious that they did not have the right to care about Luo Fan or change Luo Fan. Needless to say, in terms of necessity, at this moment, the outcome of the battle between the two of them had yet to be revealed, and they were clearly still useful to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, they clearly did not need to worry about Luo Fan attacking them and changing the situation between them. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not need to worry about Luo Fan at all. At the very least, there was no need to worry about Luo Fan for the time being. At this moment, most of the power of the 365 levels had gathered in this level, and the other 364 levels had become extremely fragile. As a result of this change, the island seemed to have turned into a bright moon. It hung in this level of the ocean of nothingness and shone brightly. The process was like using a magnifying glass to gather sunlight into a single point, which would greatly enhance the brightness of that point. Sunlight shone down. Although it was bright, it was not much different from other places. Looking from afar, it was absolutely difficult to distinguish this area from other areas just by looking at the light. However, if a magnifying glass appeared in this area and gathered all the sunlight into a single point, the situation would be completely different. In that case, the brightness of that point would far surpass other areas that were normally illuminated by sunlight. Naturally, it would become extremely eye-catching. From afar, one would definitely be able to see its existence at a glance. At this moment, the situation on this island was similar. Originally, although the power of the 365 layers on the island was not evenly distributed, it was still distributed among the 365 layers. This distribution was very similar to the distribution of power in the other areas of the void ocean layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally not very conspicuous. At a glance, it would be easily confused with the other regions of the void ocean. At this moment, the many powers in the other 364 layers of the island were gathered into another layer, which was equivalent to gathering sunlight into a certain focal point. In this way, that world was naturally extremely eye-catching. In the eyes of all living beings, it was as conspicuous as a bright moon in the night sky. Under normal circumstances, such a bright moon would definitely attract the attention of numerous cultivators. It was even to the extent that it might cause this place to become like the projection of the world and become the center where numerous cultivators gathered. However, it was clear that, under the current circumstances, being conspicuous was meaningless. After all, such an eye-catching sight was insignificant when compared to the numerous laws of heaven and earth silhouettes that existed in the layers of the sea of nothingness. How could such an insignificant bright moon attract any more cultivators? Therefore, at this moment, even though the island had turned into a bright moon, it was still calm and did not cause too much of a commotion. At this moment, on the island, where the middle-aged woman and her essence were, the battle had become increasingly intense. Countless levels of essence clashed. Not only did they collide, but they also constantly cancelled each other out. During this process, there were also countless indescribable waves that continuously seeped out. Some of them were charging at the vortex that blocked the outside world from the starry sky of the inner universe, and some were charging out towards the outside world. In fact, the impact did not have a fixed direction. There was no difference in the impact of going inward or outward. In other words, under normal circumstances, the impact inward and outward should be equally powerful. The impact toward the outside world should be similar to the impact toward the starry sky of the inner universe. However, it was clear that the significance of the outside world and the starry sky of the inner universe was different for both sides of the battle. To the abnormal will, the starry sky within was its body, an inseparable part of it. If it was damaged, it would be equivalent to a part of its body being damaged. In this case, it naturally wanted to protect the inner universe as much as possible so that it would not be damaged. However, the situation was obviously different for the middle-aged woman. What did the outside world behind her have to do with her? If it had to be said that it had something to do with the outside world, it was the outside world that was restraining her and preventing her from transcending. In this case, how could she possibly care about any damage to the outside world? She did not take advantage of the situation to attack the outside world or destroy the outside world. This was already the result of her not having any strength left. Therefore, at this moment, she completely ignored the impact toward the outside world. She allowed the impact to continuously spread to the outside world and cause more and more serious damage to the outside world. Time and space collapsed, laws and laws collapsed, heaven and earth reversed, life was dying, karma was in chaos, and so on and so forth. A lot of imaginable and unimaginable chaos appeared in the outside world. Because of such changes, this layer of the world seemed to have fallen into the end of the world. It looked completely different from before. Looking at such a world, Luo Fan, who had seen everything in his eyes, did not show any abnormal behavior because of this. He did not even intervene to offset the impact and eliminate the chaos in this world. Instead, he simply watched the world fall toward its final collapse like a stranger who had nothing to do with it. For Luo Fan, the birth of this island was just a way for him to try the cultivation route of other 6 tribulation experts in the 6th layer of the road to Tao Master. But it was not a cultivation that he absolutely could not give up. Later, after the abnormal consciousness was derived from the nature of the middle-aged woman, the function of the island was unknowingly transferred to become a place for gambling. But now, after he figured out the source of the abnormal consciousness, this purpose had become insignificant. After such several transformations, the significance of this island to Luo Fan, although it could not be said that it was no longer of any use, it had become insignificant. Therefore, at this moment, he could calmly sit and watch the battle between the middle-aged woman and the abnormal consciousness, and the impact produced by the collision of the dimensional division interweaving, but it was becoming more and more destructive to this world. The middle-aged woman could not understand Luo Fan's choice at first, but soon she understood that this was her opportunity. Of course, it was her wish to fight against the abnormal will that was born from the essence. However, during the process of this battle, Luo Fan had been watching from the side, which was also extremely uncomfortable for her. After all, although it was not necessary, she did not have the ability to stop Luo Fan from watching from the side. However, this did not mean that Luo Fan's existence did not pose any danger to them. In fact, it was the opposite. To her, Luo Fan's existence was equivalent to a rope wrapped around her neck, which could tighten and take her life at any time. Faced with such a predicament, how could the middle-aged woman not have any thoughts? How could she be willing to accept such a restriction? Naturally, she had to seize all possibilities when there was a chance to get rid of this restriction. Therefore, in her subsequent battle against the abnormal will, not only did she no longer limit the damage the impact had on the outside world, she even added fuel to the fire, directing more of the creatinine impact towards the outside world, towards an island that restricted and shackled her. The abnormal consciousness immediately knew what she was thinking. After all, the abnormal consciousness could be said to be another possibility for the middle-aged woman, another direction of development. Under such circumstances, the middle-aged woman's actions reflected what she was thinking. It was as clear as what her actions represented what she was thinking. The middle-aged woman knew that she could not hide her thoughts from the abnormal consciousness. However, just like how the abnormal consciousness knew what she was thinking, she also thought that she knew what the abnormal consciousness was thinking. At this moment, although Luo Fan was only watching quietly from the side, in fact, Luo Fan's existence did not only create pressure on the middle-aged woman, but it was also a huge pressure on the abnormal consciousness. After all, this was Luo Fan's island, his world. At this moment, they were completely in each other's world. In this case, no matter who won or lost, they would still end up in Luo Fan's hands in the end. Therefore, even if they were enemies, Luo Fan was definitely their common enemy. The middle-aged woman believed that the abnormal consciousness would definitely not refuse to get rid of Luo Fan's threat before getting rid of each other. Because of this, she did not care at all that the abnormal consciousness knew her intentions. In fact, she was even hoping that the abnormal consciousness would cooperate with her. As long as the abnormal consciousness was willing to cooperate, the possibility of them breaking free from Luo Fan's control would increase greatly. Just as the middle-aged woman thought, the abnormal consciousness did not make any targeted moves after knowing the middle-aged woman's intentions. Instead, it faintly guided the impact produced by their confrontation and did its best to direct the impact outward, toward the world outside the vortex. Through this change, the damage to the outside world became more and more severe. Vaguely, the feeling of the end of the world also became more intense and obvious. In the face of such a situation, Luo Fan was still unmoved. He just quietly watched everything that was happening. It was as if the life and death of this world had nothing to do with him, and the abnormal consciousness and the middle-aged woman's schemes did not affect him at all. His behavior made the middle-aged woman grit her teeth. No matter what, she was still a seventh tribulation powerhouse and was already used to being a powerhouse. She knew very well what kind of mentality a powerhouse would have. At this moment, Luo Fan's behavior was the most vivid embodiment of the mentality of a powerhouse. It was because he had absolute confidence that he could control everything, suppress everything, and make it so that no matter how things changed, they would not be able to escape his control. That was why he was so calm just now, as if he did not care about anything and did not care about anything. This kind of attitude was usually directed at others. Now, someone had actually developed such a mentality, such an attitude, and such a feeling. To her, it was needless to say how sullen and humiliating it was. Just you wait, when I find an opportunity, I will definitely let you know who is the powerhouse and who is the weakling, the middle-aged woman thought to herself. However, as soon as this thought flashed through her mind, she immediately felt discouraged. This was because the powerhouse and the weakling had already been determined a long time ago. All the previous encounters had clearly proven that she was only a weakling in front of Luo Fan. After feeling discouraged, she quickly set a new goal. She did not dare to think about defeating Luo Fan directly. However, to make Luo Fan's plan fail and make him suffer a big loss, this kind of thing did not seem to be a difficult thing to do. In particular, Luo Fan's arrogant attitude gave her a great opportunity. If the abnormal consciousness cooperated in the dark, it was not impossible for Luo Fan to suffer a huge loss in the end. As she thought to herself, her confidence rose again. The following situation seemed to evolve smoothly, just like the middle-aged woman's plan. The battle between her and the abnormal consciousness was still as intense as ever, and they were indeed fighting each other continuously. They were constantly competing with each other's techniques, abilities, powers, and realms. However, at the same time, they were also closely cooperating from another perspective. Under their secret guidance, the various destructive forces that leaked out from their fight were constantly vented toward the island that Luo Fan had built, and they kept destroying one of the layers of the world. Chapter 3056. Due to their secret guidance, the entire world seemed to have returned to its chaotic state in just a few short months. At a glance, the entire world had turned into a dusky expanse. Time, space, matter, energy, laws, vitality, and so on and so forth. Everything had unknowingly fused together. At this moment, the entire world seemed to no longer have any order to speak of. All order had apparently been completely destroyed by the cooperation between the middle-aged woman and the unusual consciousness a few months ago. Of course, if there was any place other than the battlefield that still had order, it would be the place where Luo Fan was at this moment. Even in this almost chaotic place, Luo Fan was still floating calmly on the spot. Of course, this place was originally a void, but it was now boundless chaos. He was merely floating in the air by himself, yet he was able to repel all chaos. Around his body, the space-time dimension that belonged to him naturally smoothed out all the chaos in the surroundings, allowing the surrounding time, space, matter, energy, rules, vitality, and so on to act according to his thoughts, naturally turning into a small world. Of course, the range was not wide. It only turned the area within several thousand feet of him into a small world. Of course, this was not because his order's influence could only extend to this range. Instead, it was because he had the intention to limit his order's influence to this range. After all, if he truly released his order's influence, the entire world, and even the entire 365 levels, would directly fall into the range of his order's influence. When that happened, all the influence caused by the middle-aged woman and the unusual consciousness would be for naught. For Luo Fan, who wanted to see how the battle between them would develop, what the final outcome would be, and what form the outcome would take, This situation was obviously unacceptable to him. Therefore, at this moment, in order to see the outcome, he forcefully restricted the influence of his order on his surroundings, limiting the area of influence to a radius of several hundred meters around him. Through this restriction, he didn't have to suppress himself too much and his existence could be stretched to a certain extent. But at the same time, it would also give the middle-aged woman and the abnormal will a chance to display their plan perfectly. At that moment, the middle-aged woman's eyes lit up. The development of the situation was even smoother than the most perfect situation she had imagined. She had originally thought that there would be some twists and turns in the matter, but she had never expected that she would forcefully reach this step and destroy the world to such an extent. What she needed to do next was to push this destruction one step further and finally push it into other worlds, pushing it into every region of this island. As long as he could complete this expansion and completely destroy the entire island, he would definitely be able to get his main body to directly take action and directly wipe out her avatar along with the abnormal will. At that time, no matter what plans or thoughts Luo Fan had, it would obviously come to nothing. Once his plan fell through, it would mean that his plans for the past few months, or even the plans for the past few years, would all be for naught. He would definitely be a waste of time and energy, but he would get nothing out of it. This might not be considered a great loss to Luo Fan in terms of strength and energy, but the sense of defeat it brought him was definitely not weak. To a certain extent, this could be considered as a huge loss to Luo Fan, and to a certain extent, this had obviously achieved the middle-aged woman's goal. Although this goal was still insignificant compared to the goals of her previous plans, under such circumstances, this was clearly the only thing he could pursue. I hope you're still as careless as before. At this time, the middle-aged woman was actually looking forward to Luo Fan maintaining the mentality of a powerhouse. He still felt that everything was under his control, and he still believed that no matter what happened, he would be able to easily deal with it. Due to their cooperation over the past few months, she thought that her cooperation with the abnormal consciousness was already quite perfect. Therefore, at this moment, she did not consider the possibility that the abnormal consciousness would have a different opinion from her. Even if her final plan was to completely wipe out the abnormal consciousness along with her clone, she would still think the same. It was not that she was too egoistic, but because the cooperation over the past few months had long given her the illusion that the abnormal consciousness was connected to her mind and that the abnormal consciousness had the same goal as her. It was precisely because of this illusion that she had such a mentality at this moment. After a few months of development, although the way they fought was still a battle between the means of dividing the dimensions, there were already a lot of things added to this battle that were not there before. For example, there were a large number of concept esoteric abilities, all sorts of strange energies, and countless indescribable powers that were buried in the countless dimensions and engaged in an extremely intense battle. Due to such a battle, the vortex at the intersection no longer looked like a vortex. Instead, it looked like a boundless world cluster with countless worlds. In fact, compared to ordinary world clusters, it looked even more complicated and incomprehensible. After all, ordinary world clusters were not divided into dimensions, and all the worlds were on the same level. However, at this moment, the vortex was divided into countless dimensions. The countless substances, energies, and strange existences seemed to overlap, but in fact they did not intersect at all. It was as if they were words on different pages. As the words on different pages of a book, if the pages were thin, one could see the words on the other pages of the book through the pages. However, it was obvious that there was a natural chasm between the different pages, and they could not come into contact with each other at all. In fact, if the words on the pages had consciousness, they would not be aware of the existence of the other pages at all. At this time, all sorts of strange things in the infinite dimensions were similar to this. To them, their world was only the dimension they were in. Apart from the dimension, everything else did not exist to them at all. As for whether they had consciousness or not, it was needless to say. Creating living beings and consciousness was not even considered a matter of lifting a finger for existences at the level of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. With just a thought, billions of worlds could be created out of thin air, let alone things with consciousness. That was right, these things with consciousness were not all living beings. There were all sorts of strange things. They could be energy, inanimate objects, magic powers, certain spaces, a certain period of time, or even the dimension itself. At this moment, the things created by the middle-aged woman and the things created by the abnormal willpower were engaged in an extremely intense battle in those dimensions. The scale of the competition had a different kind of indescribable grandeur compared to when it first started. Seems like she's going to win. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was watching coldly from the side, had such a thought. The she he was talking about was not the middle-aged woman, but the abnormal willpower. Unlike the middle-aged woman who had been completely misled by the illusion, Luo Fan, who was watching from the side, could clearly see all the changes in the universe behind the vortex. Compared to the middle-aged woman, who placed almost all of her energy on the battle at the boundary and her scheme against Luo Fan, the abnormal willpower placed more attention on the universe. The attention they paid to this intersection was only limited to the middle-aged woman's cooperation. In fact, it was precisely because of this that the middle-aged woman felt that everything was going smoothly. She felt that the abnormal willpower was already connected to her mind, and its goal was also completely the same as hers. After a few months of development, she had clearly obtained extremely shocking results. At this moment, the universe had completely changed. At this moment, the starry sky of the universe no longer looked the same as before. The starry sky of the universe now looked like a huge whirlpool. The countless stars had already shifted their positions under the adjustment of the abnormal will. Although it was not random, it was not too orderly either. It had completely converged into a huge vortex that was extremely similar to the one manifested by the abnormal will. It was just that the scale of the vortex was countless times larger. Corresponding to this change, in the spacetime where the abnormal willpower resided, the island that was originally the origin of the abnormal willpower had completely collapsed. The entire island had directly broken into pieces, and it had already completely integrated with all the stars in the universe. Or rather, it had completely fused with the huge vortex of stars in the starry sky of the universe. The abnormal willpower had clearly completely integrated with the universe and was no longer the same as before. Although it had become the essence or the will of the universe, it was still a willpower that was produced because of the abnormality. It was like a second personality that a person had developed. It was naturally very difficult for such a willpower to integrate with the universe. As long as one could think of a way to erase it, it wouldn't be difficult. But now, after such a thorough integration, the word abnormal from the abnormal willpower could clearly be removed. After such a integration, the relationship between the willpower and the universe was already so close that no existence could separate them. It could be said that at this stage, the universe was a part of the willpower, and the willpower was also an inseparable part of the universe. If the two were forcefully separated, then whether it was the universe or the willpower, they would become incomplete and might even completely collapse. If this was compared to a person, it would be equivalent to the person's second personality completely replacing the first personality and becoming the person's true personality, true self, and true consciousness. At this stage, if one wanted to erase this personality, it would be equivalent to killing the person. The significance of such an impact to the willpower was self-evident. It could be said that at this stage, the willpower could be considered to have truly become a new individual, and it could truly be considered to have obtained the foundation for an independent existence. If that was all, Luo Fan would at most be impressed by the willpower's brilliant methods, but he wouldn't think that the willpower had already won. This was why he was even more certain that the willpower had already won. The reason was very simple. It was because at this moment the willpower was gradually changing the shape of the entire universe. Although the moment Luo Fan stepped into the cosmic starry sky, it looked like a cosmic starry sky of its own, like a world of its own. However, it was clear that this situation was not natural. Its true appearance was the essence of the middle-aged woman who had the appearance of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. This true appearance meant that the appearance of the universe was actually just a form of the willpower. Furthermore, it might even just be a form that Luo Fan's consciousness and Luo Fan's choice had revealed itself. As in essence, its true appearance naturally wouldn't just be the appearance of the universe. On the contrary, this appearance could actually be considered a kind of distortion and dispersion to this essence. A distortion to make it easier for the willpower to understand and comprehend, and a dispersion to make it harder for the willpower to resist. Now that the willpower had begun to change this distortion and dispersion, it was obviously changing the situation that was easy to understand and difficult to resist. It turned out that the willpower could fight on par with the middle-aged woman. If its power became more condensed and its strength became more powerful, was there any need to say more about how the battle between the willpower and the middle-aged woman would turn out? It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan made such a judgment at this moment. He was certain that the willpower was already destined to win. However, it was obvious that the middle-aged woman clearly didn't feel anything about Luo Fan's judgment or the changes behind the willpower.